This story takes place when I was about 16 years old, and because of my living situation, at least twice a month I'd have to make a 2-hour drive from a city area back to my parents' house in a rural area. I'd say about an hour and a half of that drive was just country road with nothing but valley, corn, or some other crop on either side, with the occasional farmhouse or something you might think that people would go in and out of willingly along the way. Because of how used to this drive I was, I didn't think much of not having cell service or seeing any phone booths along the way. I mean, in all the times driving, nothing had happened yet, so surely nothing would happen ever, right? Well, in the middle of one of those drives back, while the night was slowly taking over as I was driving, I saw a flash of light in the distance. That was weird. Maybe just an anemic moment? Another flash. Well, maybe someone was coming this way and their high beams are wonky or something. And then another flash. Alright, something's wrong. I slowed down a bit as to not get blinded periodically and eased my car to the side of the road to try and figure out what was ahead. Further in the distance, I think I see a person. Actually, multiple people. My eyesight's well and good at this point in my life, so I was putting 2 and 2 together, getting close enough to realize there were 4 people on this country road, lined up across it as if to make a roadblock to prevent any cars from passing through. Another note to this is that I don't see any car around them that they could have come in or stepped out of. I don't remember any farmhouses or sheds nearby either. The rest of this encounter felt like it took place in the span of an hour because of my fear and anxiety, but it was likely no more than 5 minutes in hindsight. I'm driving maybe 10 miles an hour now as I'm getting closer and realizing that I'm definitely, without a doubt, approaching a line of 4 grown-ass people with huge, bright white masks on, staring in my direction. 2 of them definitely have bats, or some other distinctly long blunt objects, and 1 person is holding something that the flashes are coming from. I've seen enough horror movies and heard enough stories about crimes on road like this to think that in this moment, I only have 2 options. Slow down and hope they eventually part ways around my car, running the risk that they could very well get the jump on me and my dinky car, or pick up the pace and disregard whether or not they'll have the chance to move out of the way when I potentially accelerate through them. I decided on the latter. I had no means to protect myself with other than a bat in the trunk of my own car, and at this time I was a young teen who could easily get knocked down with a solid slap because of my build, and my car was trash enough to where if I stopped, I wouldn't doubt that someone could break in with ease. Now, hearing gravel and dirt kick up from under my tires, I was more freaked out at the potential that I could drive myself off the road, along with taking out some strangers, who I'm now dead certain are carrying bats as I accelerate towards them. I'm properly freaking out, but I've accepted that this was the decision that I made. I accelerated more, and thankfully the 2 that were directly in my way lunged out of the way just in time not to get hit. I stop accelerating to catch my breath, as if I needed to, and see them in my rearview mirror. The 2 that didn't have to jump out of the way, for some reason are now hauling ass towards my car, as if they could catch up, and it became so real in that moment that there were people who were intentionally trying to get the jump on me in the middle of fucking nowhere, and probably not just snot-nosed kids trying to get kicks and giggles out of freaking someone out, but real adults trying to harm someone that came that way. I just focused on driving out of there as fast as I could. I focused on going forward, didn't turn the radio back on to distract me, and felt shaken by the experience in general. The most messed up part, honestly, was getting home and realizing that part of what I was driving on wasn't gravel. It was nails that were now embedded into my tires. Praise whatever God may be out there for me somehow having those sturdy-ass tires. I didn't tell my parents the full story about what happened, and they just assumed I was being reckless and someone was playing a prank with scattering those nails about randomly on the road. I told the story to some of my friends, and they told me I probably wasn't in any serious situation, and they were just trying to get a scare out of me, especially since being in a car was a pretty big advantage in the situation, which I can't deny. Still, creeped the absolute hell out of me, and I remember it every single time I drive down a road that looks any type of similar. This is something that I add on to the end of the story after having told it to friends beforehand, but this happened before those Purge movies came out. Otherwise, I would have definitely felt more comfortable saying it wasn't creepy and just annoying/bothersome. I still wonder where they came from though, since I very clearly remember there not being a car anywhere close by, nor any buildings around. I know that this experience was mostly in a car, but because of the proximity and near intimate relation between my car and an external human's body, it definitely felt like a personal creepy encounter, and I'll stand by that much. Also, given the potential of direct one-on-one human interaction should I have slowed down enough. Had to tell this one to someone other than my friends, since they've mostly heard the story, and I just had a nightmare about it again just a night ago. I still don't know if I'm overreacting about this situation. All I know for sure is that those were definitely people, and that I was definitely afraid for my life. This happened a couple years ago now, and there really isn't much to this story, but I often find myself wondering just what could have happened. One night, me and the missus were at a pub having a couple drinks semi-close to where we lived. It was getting kind of late, so we thought it was time to walk home. As we're leaving the pub, we both are pretty hungry and just keen for some snacks. So we decide to stop at the gas station that's between the pub and our house and load up on all our favorite junk food. Now this is a walk we've done a bunch of times to get snacks on the way home, but this time, about halfway there, something happens. We're walking alongside of the road when we hear a crunching of footsteps behind us. As we both turn over our shoulders to take a look, there's a man about 50 yards behind us. In another situation, this man might be nondescript, but he stood out like a sore thumb while walking behind us in the manner that he was. No older than 30 or 40 at the most. His face looked withered though, especially in the pale light of the night. His gait was elongated and seemed just unnatural. Either way, we weren't going to stick around to pass judgment, and we just decided to press on. But as we turned back around, we started to hear his steps get louder and louder. We both admit that the vibe was off at this point, but we also weren't too far from the gas station, so we pick up our own speed, hoping that once we get there, if this dude is planning on doing something, he's less likely to do it in a well-lit area with plenty of people around. As we picked up our walking pace to a fairly brisk speed, we hear this guy start to speed up again. So we decide to pick up our pace once more, and at this point, we're basically jogging to get to this gas station. I didn't look back, but I could all but hear this guy running to catch up with us. I say that to say that this section of road this guy was following us on is extremely poorly lit. Like, there isn't even streetlights for a large stretch of time. So we were supremely thankful to see the shine of the gas station lights as we get around the corner, feeling safe in its warming glow. We go in, still wanting to get those snacks of course, and wouldn't you know that the guy follows us in, and he just stares at us the entire time we're in there. We do our best to take as much time as possible, hoping that he'd just give up on whatever he was planning and leave. Eventually, he finally leaves the gas station without buying or doing anything except for staring at us. We stop messing around at this point and go to the counter to buy our snacks. As we're leaving, we notice this guy is across the road, still eyeballing us and waiting right where we'd need to go if we wanted to continue our walk home. We decided to call a cab at that point instead of walking. We were definitely getting a dodgy vibe off this dude, and I do wonder what he was planning. I'm pretty glad I didn't find out though, because he seemed determined on us. It was odd either way, and while it may not have been the creepiest thing ever, I'm just happy nothing bad actually happened. A few months ago, I was driving home from a friend's house at about midnight. I was heading down a small one-way street that is pretty much always dead after business hours. Not paying much attention because this was the road that I drove down regularly and felt pretty comfortable on it, when a very thin woman with scraggly gray hair, maybe in her 50s or 60s, that I hadn't immediately noticed on the sidewalk, suddenly walked into the road right in front of my car. I hadn't been driving very fast, so I stopped to let her cross, although I wondered why she didn't wait for me to pass, as there were no cars behind me. She didn't cross all the way. She stopped in the middle of the street, then turned and walked right up to my car. She put her hands on the hood and leaned forward so she was locking eyes with me through the windshield. Her pupils were gigantic, her expression was angry, and she stared at me unblinkingly. She looked almost demonic. My reaction was pretty automatic. I started shaking my head and loudly repeating, "No, no, no," to try to signal that I didn't want to interact with her. She didn't move at all, and for a split second, I wondered if she needed some kind of help. But the look in her eyes and the way she didn't say anything put me completely on edge. I threw the car in reverse and lurched away from her. She stood up straight in the middle of the road, stared at me for a second longer, then turned and nonchalantly walked back to the same side of the street she had come from. I put my car in drive and hurried past her to continue home. As I peered in my rearview mirror, I saw that she had emerged back into the street, nearly the same position where I had seen her, but this time she had her hands over her head, almost in a howling position. Why? I have no idea. After the fact, I decided that this lady was probably really high on something, and maybe she didn't want to cause me any harm, but the expression in her eyes as they bore into mine was beyond creepy, and more than enough to keep me from driving down that road, whether in broad daylight or in the dead of night. I live in a city located in a valley with a lot of smaller towns up in the hills and mountains around, so it's part of the local culture for teenagers and young adults to visit these smaller areas during the winter to drink, smoke weed, and hang out with their friends. My uncle bought a house in one of these areas, so eventually I decided to get the keys and spend a weekend there with 5 of my closest friends. The house has 2 big bedrooms with 3 beds in each, and a lot of extra mattresses. At night, we decided at some point to go back inside and just chill watching TV. But since the living room had no sofas yet, we brought some mattresses from the bedrooms and just used them to hang out on. One of my friends, Victor, decided to go out to smoke, and after some minutes, we hear someone knocking at the window just behind us. Everyone got scared for a second, but looked at the window and said things like, "Oh shit, it's just Victor." But since we're sitting around on the mattresses close to the ground, it wasn't easy to clearly see who was at the window. And since the person just stood there, looking straight at one of the girls, I got up to check. I saw a man who somehow looked a lot like my friend, but a bit more fat and older than him. As I came to the conclusion that it was a stranger, I froze while looking at him, and he looking back at me. When I said to my friends, "It's not Victor," everyone else also froze and looked at me waiting for a reaction. But all I could think was to ask what he wanted. He just stood there for a second and asked,
"Hey, there's a bar nearby, and we need a drummer to play with our band. Is any of your friends a drummer by chance?"
Which, weirdly enough, I am. But I just told him no, and after some extra long seconds of staring at us, he left. My friend came back, and we made fun of the situation, making jokes on how it was him messing with us, etc. Later, most of the group decided to sleep in one bedroom and leave the second for me and one of the girls since they saw us kissing earlier. We all go to bed, but some hours later, I wake up to the girl shaking me in horror and whispering that she heard something coming from the kitchen. So I get up, tell her to lock the bedroom when I leave, and go check the sound like a moron who always dies first in the films. As I pass by the second bedroom, I think about calling someone else to join me, but as soon as I see them all sleeping, I hear something at the kitchen's window. I quickly move there in silence, check around, and as soon as I find and grab a knife, the door opens right in front of me. It was the same guy. I knew it was no joke, since I just saw my friend sleeping. It probably took about 5 to 10 seconds of each of us staring at each other, but it felt like an eternity. While still holding the door handle, he made a slow movement with the other hand towards something under his shirt, which was probably a gun or a knife, but I also lifted my hand showing him the knife that I had, so he stopped. The kitchen was quite small, so we were standing pretty close to each other, and at this point we both knew it would end badly for both of us if he tried something. So I just shook my head and said as calm as I could, "Don't." He just kept staring at me for a bit more, then finally closed the door and went away. I went back to the room, told the girl that I was with that it was nothing, and that we should go back to bed. I didn't sleep a wink that night. We left early in the morning, and I made sure to ask my uncle and cousins if they ever received weird visits there. They said that the only person who ever goes there at night is the old neighbor when his wife doesn't let him arrive drunk at home, so he usually crashes on my uncle's rocking chair to sleep it off until he's sober. Now the thing is that visitor definitely wasn't the old neighbor, and he didn't look like he was there to just crash. I don't know exactly what he was there to do, but I'm glad that I was there to keep him from doing it. Now, every year my friends talk about spending another weekend there, but I always make an excuse so we never go through that again, and they never have to know what almost happened. To give a little context to this story, I used to work at an apartment complex. As a result, I've had my fair share of creepy encounters. Most residents keep to themselves and don't cause issues. I'd say about 95% of them, but the other 5% took up almost all of my time. Isaac was one of the 5%. When he first rented his apartment, he definitely had stoner vibes about him, but he was nice enough and passed his background check. Almost immediately, however, he started causing issues. The lady next door complained she could smell his smoke constantly. The guy downstairs complained he could hear his stereo at all hours of the day and night. Another resident accused him of following him home one night. The police were regularly there breaking up fights between he and his girlfriends. We caught him hiding 2 large dogs in his apartment, and he regularly let them run loose, which ultimately resulted in another dog and 2 people being attacked. He accidentally discharged a gun in his apartment once. Needless to say, he caused a lot of issues. At first, he was very apologetic and said he would make an effort to remedy the problems himself. But things kept getting worse, and after a year of weekly calls or notices from the office, he eventually became very standoffish. One morning, I received a call from Isaac, letting me know that he'd broken up with one of his girlfriends, and she just wouldn't leave the apartment. He asked me to personally come up and remove her. I'm a small woman, so even if I wanted to take the risk, I physically wouldn't be capable of wrestling an angry woman out of his apartment. I suggested that he call the police. He then asked if I could make a maintenance man come up to remove her. I offered to call the police on his behalf, but Isaac said he didn't want to involve them and hung up on me. A few hours later, Isaac came down to the office with a jump drive and said that he needed to print out a 60-plus page document. Residents weren't technically allowed to use our office printer, but on the rare occasion someone asked to, I usually didn't say no. It was an easy way to build up good rapport after all. But between Isaac becoming such a problem tenant and how large his document was, I told him I couldn't print it. I gave the excuse that our paper, toner, print history was monitored, and we would get in trouble for printing such a large document out for him. Not liking my answer, he started screaming about how it was bullshit. He accused me of being useless, bringing up my refusal to fight his ex, and power tripping, calling me a fucking bitch multiple times, and said someone needed to bring me down a peg. I was pretty over him at this point, and told him that if he was going to behave like a child, that he needed to leave. He told me I couldn't make him. Bluntly, I told him he would leave, or I'd call the police and have him removed. I also told him that I would ban him from the office going forward. Normally, I tried to kill the residents with kindness, but his lease was ending in a week, and I just didn't care anymore. My threat seemed to work. He angrily knocked my pen holder over, then slammed both doors hard as he left. The following morning, a cop was waiting for me when I got to work. He asked if Isaac was a resident, and I confirmed that he was. The officer explained that the body of a teen had been discovered the day before, and Isaac was their prime suspect. He was the last person to text the kid, asking him to meet where his body was found shortly after the message. The police believed that Isaac had been paid to kill him. Based on the timing of the text and when the boy was discovered, Isaac would have had to have left my office and gone directly there. Ultimately, the police wanted to use Isaac's move-out day as an opportunity to try and catch him. To nobody's surprise, he didn't show up. When I walked his apartment to inspect for damage, and there was a lot, I found a bank receipt from the day of the murder. Someone had wired him $17,000. I thankfully never saw Isaac again. I do know a few things though. First, he was caught a few months later in another country, and now he's serving time in prison. And secondly, he's going to have a hell of a time trying to pass a background check anytime in the future. So this happened to me a very long time ago. I'm going to say about 35 years now. But it was definitely creepy then, especially when you add in what happened years later. I was in my early 20s and living at home while attending graduate school. I was dropped off home at night after a date with a man who later became my husband. My parents were in the living room with my older brother Eric, and I went upstairs to hang out with my two younger sisters, Sarah and Laura, in the room that they shared. The three of us, I'm sure, were talking about my date and other sister gossip, when suddenly there was a thump-like noise at the window. Sarah and I heard the noise, but didn't really pay attention to it, but Laura was closer to the window and walked up to it and opened the blinds. Suddenly, she screamed, and when Sarah looked at her and the window, we saw why. Staring back at us through the window was a man's face, on the second floor of the house, no less. Seeing this man, Sarah and I both screamed as well, and the three of us ran out of the room and sprinted downstairs, screaming that there was a man in our window. My dad immediately ran outside, alone, because my brother had some leg injury and was in a brace or a cast and was unable to join him. After a few minutes, my dad came back in and told us he didn't see the man or anyone at all, but there was a ladder laying on its side right under my sister's bedroom window. My dad called the police, who came pretty quickly and searched the area themselves. They didn't find much, though they did notice footprints leading into the woods behind our backyard. Unfortunately, they really couldn't do anything else to find the guy, though they did patrol the area for a while. Since it all happened so fast, and the three of us ran out of the room right away, we didn't get any sort of good look at the man. Not to mention, it was dark out. Thankfully, though, we never saw him again. However, about 15 years later, I'm now married and have 3 kids, and live in a house not even 10 minutes away from the house that I grew up in. I work as a nurse in a hospital, and one day there was a horrible snowstorm. The roads were awful, and tons of cars were snowed in. Me and a coworker didn't feel safe driving, so we got a ride with another coworker whose husband was picking her up and had a nice van that was way better to drive in snow. Not far from my first coworker's house, we saw an older man, looking like he was in his late 60s, walking alone on the side of the road. Our driver pulled up and asked if he was okay. The man said his car was stuck in the snow, so he just decided to walk home since it was only about a mile away, if that. We nicely offered him a ride since it was so close, which he accepted. When asked where he lived, it ended up being the very same street that I grew up on. A bit of a ways down the road, since it was a long one, but still effectively neighbors. I commented on this, saying how I grew up there and my parents sold the house a few years earlier. He asked which house exactly, and I told him. He looked at me and said, "You lived at..." Wasn't that the house that had a man looking in the window? Taken aback, I said that it was. He replied, "Oh yeah, I remember reading about that in the paper." The thing is, it was never in the newspaper, and this was something that I knew as fact. The man looking in our window was never in the newspaper, or on the news, or on the radio, or anything like that. My feeling is, this man was the peeping Tom. The man we were giving a ride home to was the same man who I saw staring into our window 15 years before. Now, obviously that could be considered quite the leap to make, but hear me out. First of all, it wasn't in the newspaper. That simply wasn't true. While it's possible this man simply misremembered how he heard about the story and assumed it was in the paper, I don't buy that for a minute. While it was extremely creepy and memorable to me and my family, was it really that memorable for a neighbor quite a few houses down to have it be the first thing he recalled about the house 15 years later? I don't think so. There wasn't any yelling or screaming outside of the house. There was no noise like a gunshot or fighting. The only thing that would be potentially memorable for a neighbor was the police being called. And even then, all they did was walk around. They didn't chase after the man or bang a door down. And again, this man in the car didn't even live next door. From his house, maybe he'd see a flashing light, but that's really it. I'm 100% convinced this man was the same man in our window all those years ago. I think me saying that's where I lived at the time gave him some sick pleasure, remembering what he did, and he wanted to see my reaction. Thankfully, I didn't have much of one in the moment, since I was so surprised that he brought it up. After he said that he read it in the newspaper, my only response was saying something like, "Oh really?" And that was that. A minute or two later, we thankfully reached his house, and that was the last time that I ever saw that creepy man. I wish that I could say that I confronted him and pressed him for an answer, but I didn't. The thoughts I now have obviously didn't come to me in that very short window we were talking in the car, but after thinking about it later and talking to my parents, I was even more convinced. I asked my dad if he knew the guy at all, and all he knew was the guy's name and that he was married, at least at the time that we lived on the street together. Obviously, we couldn't exactly do anything about it. All these years later, it's something my siblings and I will occasionally talk about and even laugh about a little bit, like teasing my brother about being unable to go look for that guy. Though it doesn't change the fact that it was genuinely a terrifying night. My sister Laura, who opened the blinds, was essentially face to face with him. Still to this day, she pins her curtains shut at night and refuses to look out windows after the sun has gone down. Telling this, over 35 years later, still gives me a bit of a chill, especially talking to that man 15 years later. If I'm right, and he was the creep, how often did he watch us through that window? Was this the only time, or just the final time? I won't say I'm happy he's no longer alive, since, as sure as I am, I can't really know it was him for a fact. But I certainly don't feel sad about it either. This story takes place when I was homeless, and I would park to sleep at a campsite up north from where I am. This night, I pulled in, parked, fed the cats, and started to cook and relax with my boyfriend. We had been there no longer than 20 minutes, when out of nowhere, flashlights appeared in our faces. 4 of them, all looking into the windows. I had assumed that it was park rangers going to ask me to move since the campsite was technically closed. I rolled down my window a bit and asked what was up, but apparently it was a family of 4, also parked and camping. They had a fire going and a dog, so I figured things were okay here, but there was a really weird feeling about it. We both ignored that feeling. My boyfriend decided to try and befriend them, so we got out to chat. They asked a lot of very pointed personal questions. Are you married? Do you live around here? Do you have any kids? But instead of the adults speaking, it was their 2 kids asking all of the questions. They spoke like adults, which made me assume maybe trauma was a real part of their lives. At some point though, the kids put themselves to bed, basically saying, "Mom, Dad, we're going to bed now." That really rubbed me the wrong way, but whatever, it just got worse from there. Once the kids retreated, the couple began talking about their converted truck that they lived in. Apparently, the kids shared a bed, and a key point that they made was that the van was soundproof. They really wanted to play with our cats, but no such luck. The husband and wife, I only remember the dude said his name was Scooter, which, really, started to try and separate me and my boyfriend by saying stuff like, "Let's walk to the river. Let's go look at the car." They were really interested in hearing about any injuries that we had, and at some point they started letting the fire go out and attempting to stand behind us a lot. That was pretty much enough for me. My boyfriend and I simultaneously stood up, leaving a few things behind, and got in the car. We started it up and just talked like, what the f***? It took all of 2 minutes for the woman of the couple to walk up to our car and ask if we were leaving. We said no, obviously, and that we were just cold. She asked to sit in the seat behind us though. I asked why. She didn't answer and asked if she could sit with us or on my lap. Utterly confused, I asked again, why? She again didn't answer. She said we can't leave her there because her husband beats her. So I asked her if she wanted me to call the police. She didn't answer, just pulled out a cigarette and lit it up, leaning against the door of our car. We looked at each other, and I heard someone douse the fire. With a feeling of extreme unease, I turned to my boyfriend, and this is when I found out that he was suspicious from the very beginning, but didn't think to say anything until now, only to add that if I had stayed and not followed him to the car, he would have just left me there. Yeah, he was a waste of space, but before I could process it, I heard the husband of the group grab something off of the fire tool set that sounded metallic and heavy. And that's when I got tunnel vision and just hit the gas. I felt that bitch bounce off the side of my van as we pulled away, and just as we got onto the road, we see flashing lights behind us in the distance. Not like police lights, but almost ambulance lights. No way was I stopping for it or pulling off to the side of the road. Do you know how easy it is to buy emergency lights for any car on Amazon? No thanks. The ambulance turned off to a dead-end road eventually, after a while of demon driving into town. We never heard a siren. We looked it up, and the aforementioned river was about 2.5 miles into the dense woods. Apparently a lot of people go missing out there. I wonder who's to blame. We reported this to the authorities the moment that we got back to town, and they said they would send a few cars up to the campground to check it out. But by the time the police got there was no trace of anybody left at that campsite. No smoldering embers from a fire, and no tire tracks but our own. While our account got called into question, I know exactly what happened up there, and it's something that I'll never forget. I'm lucky enough to not be homeless anymore, but if there's one piece of advice that I can give to anybody going through that same situation, don't interact with anybody that doesn't have a badge when you're parked at a campsite and trying to sleep. I'm a young female in my 20s, and this just happened to me about a week ago while I was on my way to school. I was taking my usual route when I got cut off by a guy who wasn't using his turn signal. I ended up having to slam on my brakes just to avoid a crash. I brushed it off though, because it wasn't that big of a deal to me. We both ended up in the left turning lane at a set of lights that has a green turn arrow at the same time that the regular light turns green. This set of lights was actually about 20 feet away from my school, and once I got through the light, I would have to immediately turn left into the parking lot. This is important for later. The light turns green, and I ease off the brake in expectation of going, but the man in front of me didn't move. Now, I don't usually honk at people unless it's absolutely necessary, but this man already had me annoyed from cutting me off, and now he was taking an absurd amount of time to turn, so I gave him a little beep to get his attention. He moved forward about a foot, and then stopped again. At this rate, we were going to miss our turning arrow, and I was getting a little pissed off. I gave him another, longer honk, and he rolled down his window and flipped me off while still refusing to move. I just wanted to get to school, and this idiot was holding up traffic, so I started beeping my horn in short bursts to annoy him into moving. I know that I probably could have handled that better, but I was tired, and this guy was acting like he had one brain cell. My incessant beeping got him to finally start moving, and he sped through the turn lane while flipping me off the entire time. I gave him the finger in return, and got through the light, and immediately turned into my school's lot. I drove through the parking lot, and around the back of the building, because that's where students are required to park, and I took out my phone to call my boyfriend, because I was worked up and needed a rant about the whole situation to someone. However, my boyfriend was busy and wasn't able to really talk, so I only got to give him a short retelling of everything, and I decided to voice record him a message while detailing the whole thing. While I was recording the message, I noticed in my rearview mirror that someone had pulled behind me into the school. I immediately knew it was the guy who I had honked at the light. He drove around the back parking lot, revving his engine and going in circles. I thought, oh shit, this guy followed me. I immediately started freaking out and called my boyfriend again. He has my number set to always ring in case of situations like this, so he answers, and I say, he followed me. My boyfriend tells me to immediately call the police. During this time, the guy in the car had pulled up directly beside my car, started honking at me the same way that I had honked at him, only keeping direct eye contact with me the entire time. He then began yelling and screaming about how I needed to show him respect and other incoherent things. To be honest, I was so scared that I could barely pay attention to what he was saying. I hung up with my boyfriend and immediately called 911. I showed this guy my phone in an attempt to display that I was dialing emergency services, and it seemed like he didn't care one bit. He continued to scream and berate me, all before exiting his vehicle, circling around, and coming face to face with me, with only my driver's side window between us. This man, still in a rage, slams his hand over and over against my window in an attempt to puncture through it. My heart is beating out of my chest, as I'm worried that my window may not hold. But just as the dispatcher picks up the other line of the call, and I'm sure all the color has drained from my face, this man stops his assault on my window, leans down, and flashes the creepiest grin I've ever seen in all of my days. I can only assume that at this point, he was thoroughly content with how freaked out he had left me, because at this point, he stood straight up, strolled back around to the driver's side of his car, got in, stared at me a moment longer, and then casually waved as he drove off. I gave the police a description of him, his vehicle, and his license plate number. After getting off the phone with the dispatcher, I was left shaking in my car, still utterly terrified as to what just happened. There really isn't much more to this story. I gave my statement to the police, but they couldn't find him, and I haven't heard anything since. I know this may not be the scariest story in the world, but it was horrifying at the time. I'm just left thankful that window glass is as strong as it is, because who knows what would have happened if his hand did make it into my car. I had this experience years ago, but I always find myself wondering how differently things could have gone. I was around 17 or 18 at the time, and I had gone with a friend to a pub that wasn't so bothered with checking ID, so we had quite a few drinks. We left when the pub closed, and I walked my friend home. She lived about 5 minutes away from the pub. I was supposed to be staying at my sister's house to babysit for her the next day, but I had missed the last bus and decided to walk to her house. This was about an hour-and-a-half walk that I had done plenty of times before during the day, and it didn't even occur to me that a girl wandering around on her own in the middle of the night was a dumb move. I would never go out alone now, but I made that decision that night. So I'm walking, and most of the route is through residential areas, some gas stations and closed shops, etc. Around an hour or so into the walk, there's a 20-minute or so gap between one housing estate and the next. It's separated by a country lane with fields on either side. I know that this country lane is coming up, and as I'm getting closer and the alcohol is worn off, I'm starting to think that I'd made a stupid decision. The roads had been pretty quiet, and by now it was probably around 3:30 a.m. A white car drove past me heading towards the country lane, but I didn't really think much of it. About a minute later, the same car drives back in the opposite direction, slowing down as it passes me. All of the windows are tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside. The car turned around further back and passed me once more, heading back into the country lane area. And that's when I thought, oh, I was coming to the end of the housing estate and closer to the country lane. So I darted off to my right, into the housing estate, and waited out of sight for what felt like forever. But looking back, it probably wasn't more than a few minutes. I heard a car pass by a few times, and then all went quiet. I thought it was probably safe to continue now. I came out of the estate, looked about, and couldn't see anyone around, so I continued on my journey. About 5 minutes or so into the quiet, and the same white car drove past me from behind and parked up a little way in a turnout on my side of the road. I slowed my pace and started to internally panic. I didn't want to turn around because then the car would be behind me, and that thought scared me even more. I couldn't cross over because there was no footpath on the other side of the road, so I'm just slowly walking towards this white car, getting more and more scared. Just then, a taxi pulled up next to me, and the driver rolled down his window and asked if I wanted a lift home. I was already panicking and almost screamed at him that I don't get into cars with strangers. He said he had a daughter about my age, and he wouldn't want her out at this time. I just looked at the taxi, looked at the white car, before deciding that the taxi was my best bet and jumping in. As we drove off, I looked back and saw the white car speed off in the other direction. The taxi driver dropped me off at my sister's house with no further issue. I always think back and think, firstly, how could I have been so stupid to take that walk? And secondly, what would have happened if that taxi driver hadn't decided to stop? In 2014, I moved to England from Canada to gain work, travel experience, and also to find myself. I ended up living in Essex with 3 other roommates. They were all women, all a bit older than I was. I was 24 at the time, Megan 31, Cherry was 34, and Cassie was 38. Megan was from New York, Sherry from New Jersey, and Cassie from Poland. All four of us shared this 3-story flat. The back of our home was the living room and kitchen, and the back wall was complete glass that looked out into our garden. The garden was completely fenced in. The house had an interesting living dynamic, to say the least. I adored all of my roommates, except for Cherry. After living with Cherry for 7 months, I was over her antics. One day I come home from work, lock the door behind me, make myself something to eat, and go up to bed. I brought some work home with me, so I'm in my nightie with all these papers around me and my headphones on, jamming out. I had headphones on because Cherry was out to dinner with some friends. That meant booze, and then sometime after, there would be a tantrum surely to come. I just didn't want to have to listen to her crazy scream crying. I'm working away, completely focused, until I feel something. I look up to see a man standing over me. I don't register it right away, and I passively say, "Cherry's room is on the 2nd floor." I said it so flippantly because Cherry seemed to regularly bring home strange men. He doesn't leave, though. Again, I say, "Cherry's room is downstairs, you..." He then interrupts me. I'm not here for Cherry. A cold chill iced my veins. My fight or flight kicked in just then. I start surveying the situation, and as I look him up and down, I see that he has a bottle of Prosecco in one hand and a knife in the other. He's about 5'10", wild, muddy brown hair, and black eyes. He has a light blue polo shirt on, and one side of his collar is popped up, and he has a distinct Manchester accent. Once I focused in, I realized his eyes were black because his pupils were completely dilated. Shit. I was in trouble. I needed an escape plan. Unfortunately, this man was standing in between me and my bedroom door. I needed to get downstairs, but I needed for him to think it was his idea, so I decided to play along. Just then, he uses his knife to pop the cork, and Prosecco starts flowing onto my carpet. I said, "Oh no, let's clean that up. Besides, I prefer to drink out of a proper flute anyways." He nodded, replying, "Yeah, you're a proper classy bird. Let's go." I try to act as natural as possible. I try not to show him that I'm shaking all over, while I try to gain control over my breathing. We take the long journey down to the main floor of my flat, all 3 floors. He has the back of my nightie bunched up in one hand, and I could feel the point of the knife graze my back with the other. I was trying to playfully speak with him as we walked down the stairs, but I couldn't tell you what I was saying, most likely just rambling. I couldn't hear anything over my heart beating in my ears anyway. We get to the bottom of the stairs, and there's a hallway to my left that leads to the front door. On my right, which is much closer to us, is the kitchen and living room. We make our way into the kitchen. I point to the cabinets that had the wine glasses. He said he knew where they were and started towards them. I now had the kitchen table between us, so it was time to run. I burst into a sprint down the hallway towards the door. My hands fumble over the locks, shaking and sweating. I swing open the door and see 2 men walking across the street. They must have been walking home from the train station nearby. So I call to them, ask for help, when suddenly I'm flung to the ground. Little pebbles piercing my skin sent sharp pains where they jabbed. The intruder pushed me out of the way to run and escape. One of the men chased after the intruder while the other said for me to go inside, while he surveyed my home, and he told me to call the police. I lock the doors before I pick up the phone, and while I'm on the phone with dispatch, I maniacally run around the house to double check all the windows and doors. Suddenly, I hear a loud bang on my front door. I inform dispatch of the banging, and she tells me that the police weren't there yet. I thought it might be one of the gentlemen who helped me, but I go out to look through the eye hole, and it's him, the intruder. He came back. He's banging on my door, screaming that I had his glasses and that he was not done with me. I absolutely freak out at this point. The dispatcher attempts to calm me down, but I'm losing my ever-loving mind. She then said, "They're pulling onto your street now. You should hear their sirens." I did, thank God. The intruder then blasts off. One officer jumps out of the passenger side while the car is still moving and chases after him. The second officer comes into my home, interviews me and the two gentlemen, collects some evidence, and takes photos. After some time of him being there, Cherry comes home and freaks out herself. Once the situation was explained, she said, "Oh my God, that could have been me." Yeah, thanks, Cherry. Everything's about you. The next morning, I'm called in to identify the man that they had in custody. I pointed him out. I go into a little room, and the officer pulls out an evidence bag. He asked me if the items were mine. They were. There were my underwear, photos taken from my home, and a couple of small trinkets that were sitting on my dresser. The officer informed me that the intruder had been stalking me for some time now. He estimates about 3 months. He had made a nest outside of our home, on top of a hill that overlooked into our living room and the kitchen. He's a known violent offender, as well as a drug dealer. The officer then told me how lucky I was to get out practically unharmed, considering that others just weren't so lucky. My mother's dog, Punky, was a very sweet and gentle dog. She was an emotional support animal, but also trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I had never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years that she lived, never growled or nipped anyone, and she had no sense of smell, so she loved all animals and people, a real gentle giant among our little terriers at 60 pounds. What I'm getting at here was that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only ever saw it once. When I was 11, I was at home with my siblings, a 2-year-old brother and a 6-year-old sister. My then stepdad is at work, and my mom ran up to the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods on a dead-end road at the time, and you had to really make an effort to get down our road, find our place, navigate down our rickety driveway, and then find the door. I'm sitting at the computer, having a grand old time watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden, all of our dogs, 2 Boston Terriers and 1 Chihuahua, perk up, bark a few times, and start investigating down the hall. My siblings were napping in the bedroom at the end of the hall at the time, so I figured they just stirred and scared the dogs. But then Punky sits up suddenly, stands up on the couch, and puffs her chest out. Her ears are perked up, her fur standing on end, her tail straight up, and then she barks. Loudly. I mean, the bark booms through the living room and echoes around, and all of a sudden, she lunges off of the couch and goes tearing down the hallway. I'm already on edge because I don't think I've ever heard her bark. Ever. She's a Basenji mix, so her bark is more of a bang sound, but this was a big, loud, alert bark. I stand up and go to look down the hallway, ready to fight off what I'm assuming is a shadow monster based on how the dogs are acting. But then I hear it. Knock, knock, knock. We didn't get visitors because of how weird our house was, location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The only people who showed up were family, and they didn't knock, so I slowly walked towards the door. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky. And I felt better with our 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were all the size of New York City sewer rats. I opened the door just a bit, and standing on our porch is the sketchiest man that I think I've ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. He was really thin, tall, with dark hair, and a sunken face, bags under his eyes, and this half-managed hair, sort of like he just gave a quick brush and then figured it was good enough. Everything about him seemed just a little too thin, a little too shallow, and his clothes, well, they were all off too. They were nice, but fake nice, you know? Like a clean, newer looking t-shirt and new jeans, but he had what looked like a suit jacket on. All his clothes were dark too, despite the fact that it was summer in Texas and the weather was definitely into the hundreds that day. He also had this plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like the label had been covered up and taped over. I stare up at him in confusion because I definitely don't know this man, and I ask what he wants. He smiles at me in this way that's way too fake, like this exaggerated and forced grin. And he spoke in the same voice retail workers do. "Hey there, kiddo. I'm trying to sell this carpet cleaner here." And he shakes the bottle at me. "Mind if I come in to show you how good it works?" Alarms are going off in my head because he just seems so off. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact that he didn't ask if my parents were home is unnerving, because he probably knew that they weren't, and that's why he was there in the first place. I should have told him to get off our property and that I'd have to go get my mom, but I didn't. Instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, we don't have carpets." "Well, it works on other things," and he took a big step towards the door and shook the bottle at me. I start to freak out and think to close the door, but the thing is, our front door didn't even have a lock. It was a small town, hard to access home. We never needed a lock, so it's basically useless. I'm sure there's something very wrong about to happen, and I'm terrified as I think about what to do in the few seconds I think I have before it does happen, when all of a sudden, I hear it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared and snarling like she was feral. She had slobber just dripping from her mouth, her ears were down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy hears it too, and as I look towards Punky, she tries to lunge past me, and I just barely catch her with my leg as she tries her hardest to duck past me and attack this guy. He freaks out and runs off the porch without another word, booking it down the driveway as I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs as they start chasing him. Our small dogs chase him down the driveway and stop about halfway, barking and jumping about. But Punky, she stops on the porch and just watches him with her ears perked, just staring out into the distance until he disappears. I swear I saw someone join up with him running when he got onto the road. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. No barking or growling, just laying around, mouth and throat covered in slobber still. I realize my siblings are still down the hall, so I run to check on them. And when I get to the bedroom, they were still sleeping soundly. But the bedroom window, well, it was wide open. The curtains pushed all to one side, and the items on the dresser in front of the window all shoved around. Someone had tried to climb through the window, no doubt in my mind about it. From what I can gather, the bedroom window was visible from the couch where Punky was sleeping. So I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky went after them and scared them off. And the man at the door, well, he was meant to distract me. They definitely didn't expect Punky, a bigger dog, because most of the time, she was with my mom inside, while the other smaller dogs were the ones roaming the front yard. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house, and on our way there, we saw the men walking up someone else's driveway. Men, plural, because we watched a second one split off to wait by the road. We called the police shortly after, but to this day I don't know if anything came of it. I will say though, the lesson that I learned from this whole thing is that it pays to have a big dog around. R.I.P. Punky. I'm a 19-year-old French student, so please excuse my English. This event happened last week, as I was heading to my apartment after seeing my friend. I took the tramway at about 11:30 p.m. because I don't feel comfortable walking at night. As soon as I sat, a man who was already sitting nearby came and sat in front of me. I had a very strange feeling about it, so I texted my boyfriend. When I stood up to get out of the tram, the man quickly got out after me. He was weirdly following me, but not walking behind me. He was walking next to me. I was getting very anxious with every passing step, knowing that something was wrong. But I continued to press on and just tried to walk to the street that I lived on as quick as possible. I crossed the street and he didn't follow, so with the little extra space between us, I thought everything was okay. But a few seconds later, he crossed the road too and found himself walking right behind me. But then he passed, and as he was walking in front of me, I thought I was just being paranoid and that he was walking his way too. But near my building, he stopped and waited until I met him. He asked me if I had a boyfriend and all. I answered, "Yeah, I do. Have a good night," as polite as I could be. He then proceeded to leave in front of me, so I was walking slower for him to be far, far from me, and to make sure that he didn't know I was almost home. I turned into the little pathway heading to the lobby of my building, still anxious about this man, even though he continued to walk. I thought I had put my keys in my pocket, but they were in my bag, which meant I spent a little extra time at the lobby entrance, fishing through my bag for my keys. As I get them into my hand, I feel this strange feeling, and I peek behind myself to see that same man running up from behind me. I got the door open, flung myself in, and attempted to close the door as quickly as possible. He hit the door violently, with a horrific look on his face. That's when I knew that I was getting into real trouble. So without even thinking, I screamed as loud as I could, and I think that's what saved my life. As the man gained entrance, he ran towards me, pushed me hard to the ground, and started to choke me. I was so stunned because I wasn't prepared for such a violent assault. While he was choking me, I couldn't scream at all, or even breathe, and nobody was coming, so I really thought my time was up. I felt my light flickering away as I was staring into his bulging eyes, his staring into mine with pure hate. It's at this point that I believe I lost consciousness. I'm not sure for how long, but it felt like an eternity. When I opened my eyes again, he had just ran out. I had the wife of the caretaker of the building right beside me. The caretaker himself was chasing after the man, but didn't manage to get him. He came back and called the police, and they caught the man within 10 minutes thanks to our description. I really don't know why he did that to me, because when he attacked me, he didn't try to assault me in a certain way or rob me, and that would have been easy. I can't understand that his only goal was to kill me. I'm forever indebted to the caretaker of the building who came to help me and saved my life because nobody else in the building called the police or even tried to help. The man was judged 3 days later and is in jail now, although he denies every account, even though me, the caretaker, both identified him, and there's video of him following me home. I hope he sits in jail for a long, long time. My worst fear is that he gets out and tries this again with somebody else, and that he successfully extinguishes their life. I grew up in a small, rural town where nothing ever seems to happen. The sort of place where it wasn't unusual to leave your doors unlocked, and for your closest neighbors to be about a mile or so from your house. Our family also had this giant old cat named Tag, who was a bit of a drama king sometimes, but we loved him. One summer, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, the cat starts going ballistic. Tag generally slept in my room, curled up next to me until I fell asleep, and then he would get up to do whatever cat things he wanted to do in the middle of the night. Occasionally, he would meow or try to wake me up on unfortunate nights when he could see the bottom of his food bowl and needed a midnight snack. Usually, if I ignored him, he would give up, or rarely go try to wake my mom up instead. This night, however, he bangs up against my parents' bedroom door until he gets in and is meowing loud enough to wake us all up. Our bedroom doors were next to each other, and I called a tag to come to bed because it's about 2 a.m. He's having none of it though, and begins to carry on. My mom gets up, goes down to the kitchen, and then huffs back up with Tag on her heels, still meowing insanely. She said his bowl had plenty of food in it, and he just walked her to the door of the kitchen. Tag was an indoor and outdoor cat, but he had his own cat door through the garage, so there was no need for one of us to let him out. My mom said my brother must have left the kitchen door open, because just the screen door was shut, but she wasn't going to stand there and hold it forever for the cat to just stand there and not go out. She shut the kitchen door and went back to sleep, firmly shutting her bedroom door this time, so Tag couldn't let himself back into their room. I keep treats for Tag in my room, so I offered him one, but he was still meowing at the door, trying to get my parents up. So I physically grab him and bring him into my room, shut the door, and try to get him to go to sleep. I lay in bed trying to get myself back to sleep, and Tag meows at my door wanting back out. I finally open my door, and he bolts back downstairs towards the kitchen. And that's when I heard what sounded like a door slamming. I have 3 older siblings though, and someone is always up watching TV or running to the bathroom, so I think nothing of it. The cat finally slinks back into my room, but instead of curling up in my armpit like usual, he sat at the bottom of my bed, just staring at the door. I fell asleep until morning, when some commotion wakes me up, and I plod down to the kitchen to find my parents on the phone with the police. They got up as usual to get ready for work, and while making coffee, my mom went to grab her rings from the little jewelry dish she had by the sink, because she would take them off in the evenings to rinse dishes and load the dishwasher, but discovered that the dish was empty this morning. It's a small town, so the sheriff sends a deputy over, and when my dad walks out to meet him, he sees that the ATV is missing from our backyard. The key is off the key ring as well. My brothers are all up at this point too, and we're all freaked out that while we were sleeping, some robber came in and removed the ATV key, while also seeing an opportunity to take my mom's rings. They were asking if we had any clue when it happened, and my parents say no. My mom asked my middle brother, who was a freshman in college and home for the summer, what time he ended up off the couch last night, and if he heard anything. He said that he went to bed at 10 or 11 and asked what she meant, as his bedroom was in the basement, and he wouldn't have heard anything in the kitchen. She looked at him puzzled, saying, "But you were in the living room when I went to feed the cat and then shut the door that you left open. I told you not to sleep on my couch and go to your bed as I went back upstairs." He told my mom that he was in the basement since dinner that night and never went out or came upstairs again. She goes white and realizes that the cat must have been trying to warn us when someone had entered the house. We only realized later that the robber dove onto the couch and covered up to hide when my mom went downstairs, and then exited once she went back to bed. The cops said for someone to be so brazen, they probably knew our family, knew our habits, but didn't count on the cat being so overprotective, and had probably intended to steal more, but was afraid that the cat may wake the whole house. It's been over 20 years since this happened, and the robber was never caught, but it's unnerving to think it was probably someone who had been to our home before, as a friend. Thank God for our cat. I miss Tag to this day. Before I start this story, I just have to say, man, I'm old. Years ago, let's say in the mid-1990s, I worked as a woodland firefighter while in the Army Reserves. I worked as a spotter. Basically, I was stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds. I would use binoculars and look out for fire, smoke, and other telltale signs of fire. My nearest compadre was about 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on the lookout for anyone who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildlife, and staying afoot of bears and wolves. The way our shifts worked back then was 1 week on, 1 week off. We pretty much did everything in those towers. We'd sleep there, cook our food there, eat there, do our rounds, and even shower and bathe there. One day, I came across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends, so I knew to safely set off the trap and then pick it up to take to the ranger station on one of my treks out for food in my Jeep. Poaching is illegal in the park, and it carried a big fine, even back then, plus some jail time, but it didn't stop the poachers from trying. I heard rifle shots and headed back for my fire tower. We did have a rifle in the tower to be used just in cases of emergencies. Just a few months back, a fellow spotter had been mauled to death by a grizzly, so each tower had been outfitted with a rifle. I looked with my binoculars, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I radioed my coworker Ben, an older guy in the adjacent tower. He hadn't heard anything today, but had come across a few traps himself. That night, after a dinner of franks and beans and toast, I was riding to my future wife when I heard a rumbling of a truck. Thinking it may be Ben, occasionally he made the trek over. We would crack open a soda and chew the fat for a bit. Instead, I saw 4 men with rifles get out of the truck. One looked around and leaned up against the truck while the other 3 grabbed traps and began to set them up. I grabbed the rifle and my lantern and headed down the stairs. I was only 21, a farmer's son from a rural Virginia farming town. I was naive. I should have called it in to the Rangers, but instead, I thought I could talk some sense into these 4 dangerous men. I barely got a, "Hey, how you doing?" out of my mouth before I was roughly shoved by rough hands. My lantern fell, and I heard it crack. The rifle I had was kicked away from me, and I felt the breath leave my chest when I was violently kicked in the stomach. I had barely caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men, lifted up, and shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we walked for miles, but in reality, it was probably only a fraction of a mile. However, I noticed that there were no sounds. In the forest, it's rarely silent. It's a cacophony of sounds, even at night. Owls, wolves, crickets, but on this night, nothing. Suddenly, I was shoved onto my knees, and I felt hot tears begin to well up. I thought of my parents, my little sister and brother, and my fiancé who were back home in Virginia. I heard the rack of a gun, and I shut my eyes and prayed. Suddenly, the night erupted. It was the sounds of sirens, those of forest rangers, and behind them, in his pickup, Ben, who had tried to radio me. When he heard the sounds of engines approaching my fire tower, when I didn't respond, he called in the cavalry. The poachers were arrested there and then, and Ben drove me back to my tower. I was still shaking the whole time. He didn't lay into me for not following procedure. He just said, "That was close, kid." I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home, but I never ran into any more poachers during the rest of my time there. I kept in contact with Ben for a while, sent him a wedding invite, and then a photo of my firstborn son in 1997. However, as time usually does, we lost track of one another. And by the time I Googled him a few years back, I learned that he passed away a few seasons prior. He was 82. It still sucks to this day that I couldn't give Ben a proper goodbye, especially seeing as that's the man that rescued me from my first and only run-in with poachers. For a little bit of context, I work at a gas station in the backwoods of Tennessee, and that's where this all took place. Last night, when I clocked in at 8 p.m., the store was completely dead. I figured it was going to be an easy night because the road the station is on isn't the main road. Actually, it used to be up until about a decade ago, when a new freeway was built. This led basically every business that was here to pack up and leave their old building abandoned. Thanks to this, there are a lot of abandoned buildings on this stretch of road that local druggies tend to claim as their own. Anyway, at around 11 p.m., I only had about an hour left on my shift, so I figured I should actually get some work done instead of just sitting around and doing nothing. I'm lucky enough to work my shift alone, which is normally pretty great because I get to do whatever I want, so long as I get what I need to get done finished. I noticed we were almost out of barbecue chips, so I'd have to restock them from our storage space, which is for some reason in the basement of the station. I've always hated going down there, just because it gives me the creeps. Why the owner decided to store everything down there is beyond my comprehension. I got about halfway down the steps before something fell on the other side of the room, and it sounded like footsteps were coming my way. I sprinted back up the stairs and locked the door to the basement, panicking like a madman the entire time. When I got back upstairs, I went behind the counter to the store computer so I could check the security cameras. I flicked over to the one that looks into the basement, and there was this guy just standing there, smiling up into the camera. He had a look of absolute insanity on his eyes, but he didn't look like the average junkie in the area. He was clean-shaven and dressed in what looked to be jeans and a button-up of some kind. Honestly, if he had walked into the store, I wouldn't have batted an eye. But because he was down there and just looking into the camera smiling, it shook me to my core. I called the store owner, and at first he was pretty mad that I called him so late. But once he heard how freaked out I was, his tone changed. He told me he'd be there in 15 minutes, and just to lock the main door to the store and make sure the man didn't go anywhere. I asked if I should call the police, but for some reason, he didn't want me to do that just yet. I locked the entrance to the gas station and went back to looking at the man. He was still there, just smiling up at me. About 3 or so minutes of him staring at me later, and he walked out of view of the camera. My boss showed up soon after, armed with a shotgun. And when I let him in, he immediately went to the basement. I went with him just because I felt safe with there being another person there. But we found nothing. There was a spilled box on the ground, lying opposite from the main entrance, but there was no sign of a person. And the only other exit down there didn't look like it had been tampered with in years. My boss ultimately chalked this up to me being tired and hallucinating the man. But I know what I saw. This has me scared shitless as I clock back into work in a few hours, and I'm absolutely dreading it. I don't know who that man was, how he got down there, or how he left, but I do know this. I'm going to keep one eye on that security camera all shift. I live in a city with a public transportation system that happens to be spotty at best. They've been extremely short-staffed, and more often than not, you have to call to just make sure your bus is even coming. On weekdays, during business hours, the public transit operator will order a lift for you to get to work if your bus isn't showing up, or if they're short a driver. Tuesday, I'm at the bus stop after checking multiple times if my bus is coming, only to find out that it wasn't. They ordered me a lift, and this nice, older gentleman was my driver. We had casual conversation, and he started to ask me personal questions. I'm a bartender, and I'm super friendly already, so I didn't think his questions were ill-intentioned. I told him that I'm not married, and that I'm pretty much a loner. I basically go to work and go home and spend time with my family. He then says, "I'd marry you in a heartbeat." Again, I'm just thinking he's being funny or nice. I asked him to drop me at the downtown grocery store so I could pick up some things I needed for work. When we stop, he said that he was only joking, that he's married, and has a son my age. He asked if I was interested in maybe meeting him. Since I have a terrible track record, I figured it wouldn't hurt meeting someone out of my circle and comfort zone. So I gave the man my number, and we parted ways. The next morning, he texts me and asks if I need a ride to work. I told him that he didn't have to do that, and I was sure my bus was running. He said it would be his pleasure, and he'd pick me up at my house at 3. Then about an hour later, he asked if I wanted to have lunch with him before work. I told him that I was busy and that I couldn't do that. He said, "Okay, see you at 3 then." He shows up at 3 and lets me know that he's outside. While I'm finishing getting my things together, I open the door and he's starting to walk up the stairs to my house. I told him that I was ready and we could head downtown now. When I get in the back seat, he turns around and says that he has a confession for me. He told me from the time that I took my mask off, his heart danced like a butterfly. He said that he hasn't been able to stop thinking about me since the day before, and that he'd love to spend time with me, and that he'd even pay me for my time if I spent the day with him. That's when I started to feel super uncomfortable with the situation. The whole ride was making me cringe, but I felt like it was better to play along and be nice than to freak out. He continued on the entire ride about how he loved me at first sight and wanted to make me his Lebanese queen. As we got closer to downtown, I started to feel relief. He dropped me off at my hotel and said that he'd see me tomorrow. That evening at work, I checked my phone after a busy happy hour, and he's texted me a few times. He sent me a picture of the hotel and said that he'd wait for me to get off to give me a ride home. I told him that I already had one, but thank you anyway. Well, Thursday morning, and I'm out running errands with my mom and sister. He texts me again and asks how early he can pick me up because he can't stop thinking about me. I asked him to please stop at that point and that I was with family. He continues to text me all day and evening, begging to see me. He tells me that his heart is aching to see his Lebanese queen, and I just keep telling him to stop. Friday morning, the hit the fan. He tells me he loves me no matter what, that he told his wife about me, that he's in love with me, and that he wants a divorce. I told him no, please don't do that, and that it wasn't right to treat his wife that way. He said it wasn't my fault. They were drifting apart anyway. Then he said that I'm picking you up for dinner at 5:30, and I'm not taking no for an answer. I ignored the messages during the day and just went about my business. Around 5:25, my video doorbell rings, and he's standing on my porch. I told him that I wasn't home and that he should leave. He continues to text me and beg to come pick me up from my parents. That was the fake location that I gave him, although I was at home the whole time and just too scared to let him know that. I eventually called the non-emergency police line, but he had already left by the time I got through. I filed a general report, but technically they can't do anything unless he's standing on my porch threatening me. They advised me to report through Lyft, so I did just that. I immediately blocked the number that he was texting me from as well. I've done everything that I can to keep my guard up, and I hope that I've seen the last of this man. What adds to my uneasy feeling, though, is that my doorbell sends me notifications anytime there's movement in front of my house. Well, the last few evenings, around 2:30 a.m., the same car has pulled up in front of my house and stopped for a few minutes at a time. I can't tell who's behind the wheel. I can't even tell if that was the car that I was in. But last night, the driver got out, crept slowly up to my door, and left something on my doorstep. I didn't get the notification until I woke up in the morning, but I immediately went outside to see what it was. What I found was a handwritten note with a bow on it, addressed simply to my Lebanese queen. Okay, I should start this story by giving a bit of background so that you understand the situation a bit better. I, a 4'9", 16-year-old female at the time, had 2 dogs who were brothers from the same litter. They were boxers, so they were relatively big and quite protective when they needed to be. Vince was longer, much taller than his brother, and is usually the kind to sleep through a hurricane if we had one. His brother Maury was shorter but more muscular and stronger. These two were pretty much with me 24/7, as my mother used to work a lot, and I was usually alone most of the day, sometimes even until after dark. This never really bothered me. I'd been left alone at home like this since I was about 11. It never struck me that I had a reason to be worried. One day, my mom was working later. I was doing some household chores, feeding the dogs, doing the dishes, stuff like that. I continued doing what I always had, a routine of tidying the house that I had done every day for years. As I went to take the trash out of the bin, I started walking towards the door when Maury stepped in front of me. I tried moving around him, telling him to get out of my way, but he refused to budge. This was certainly odd, and looking back on it now, I realized he was probably trying to stop me from walking outside. We continued like this for a few moments, me trying to get past him, and him, of course, never moving from his spot. As a big dog, he was quite heavy. It was hard to lift him, and even harder to get him away from something. Now, in the time we had been going back and forth with this interaction, Vince stayed happily asleep in his dog bed. I should note that from my kitchen, you can see the living room and bathroom. Usually we use the side door from the kitchen to enter and exit the house, since it attached to the carport. After a few more moments of trying to get around Maury, I heard something that I hadn't expected when I made one last desperate attempt to move him. He growled, which wasn't unusual as he had growled plenty of times in his life. What was unusual was that he growled at me. He had never done that before, not even once. But for that reason, and that reason alone, I decided not to take the trash out that night. I simply tossed it into another room and left it be. A short time passed, maybe a half hour or so, and I had gotten settled into my chair to watch some movie while I waited on my mom to come home. While I was watching, I suddenly heard a quiet knock at the side door. As I mentioned earlier, you can clearly see the living room from the kitchen, so I heard the knock pretty well. It was already after dark, so I figured it was my mother, and that she had somehow forgotten her keys. I got up, went into the kitchen, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the hook near the door. The hook where the keys tend to be. To some people, that's not a big deal, but to me, it meant that the person knocking on my door was in fact not my mother. My mom is a bit of a routine-obsessed person, so if she actually had forgotten her keys, they would most definitely be on that hook. I took a breath, preparing myself to just not answer the door, or if they didn't leave, to tell them that I wasn't interested in whatever they were selling or whatever they were doing. Thinking about it now, I really wish I hadn't even looked out that window of that door. I wish I had just sat back down, called my mom, and stayed out of sight. But of course, I walked in front of the door and immediately came face to face with a figure on the other side of that window. Now it was really dark outside, with just my neighbor's light shining from his porch, so I could only make out a couple of things on this guy. He was tall, me having to peer up at him through the window to look at his face. He had long hair that looked like a shadow over his shoulders in the dim light, but the only facial feature I could really see were his eyes. And God, I wish I hadn't seen them. I could see the spark of interest flare in them as he perked up when he saw me. They were wide and staring down right at me. He took a step towards my door, stepping up on the first two of the steps. I heard him say something along the lines of, "My car broke down nearby. Can I come in and use your phone?" Immediately, I thought of every bad thing that I had ever heard happening to a teenager home alone, and tried to compose my nerves. I'm not sure what it was, but something, everything, told me not to trust this man. I shouted back a quick no and an apology, hoping that he was telling the truth, and would just go to the next house over. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said it again, quite a bit louder this time. I thought for a quick moment that he hadn't heard me, but then again, I know now that he most likely had. So instead, I became a bit more confident and said, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Go to the next house." For a moment, he paused, as if contemplating what to do next. Then he knocked again, louder than the first time that I'd heard it. My heart rate increased as I just stared at him. When I didn't react, he started to loudly bang against the door. I took a step back, praying to whatever God that he would either leave or my mom would be home early. I was usually a quiet girl, but my mom was a badass redneck with a raptor knife. She could take him. He started to bang on the glass after a moment, my mind racing 1,000 miles an hour. Should I hide? Run? My phone was in the other room, and I was scared to take my eyes off this guy. I was sure he would break through the glass. The banging was vibrating my eardrums, and apparently, it was vibrating Maury's too. I saw him creeping up past the doorway, bending his head, teeth bared, and he started to bark loudly. The guy stopped for a moment, trying to see into the window at the floor where Maury stood. When he stopped barking, the guy mistakenly tried to jiggle the door handle. Now that's when Vince woke up. I swear to God, for a dog that was dead asleep 5 seconds prior, I'd never seen him move that fast. Vince had his paws up on the door, growling like a hellhound at the devil's side, at the sight of this man outside my home. The guy jumped, fell back, and bolted. I heard him say something as he started to run, and saw another shadow emerge next to him. Once they were gone, I sprinted across the carport to my neighbor's, and my mom came home shortly after. We called the police after I explained what had happened, and my neighbor had dragged his shotgun out before they even got there. He had insisted on looking for the guy himself. The police had said that someone tried to pick the lock on my front door, but there was a lot of stuff in front of it, and it was also really old, so it didn't open anymore. I went to bed that night, uneasy, and so very thankful I had 2 dogs who were not only strong and big, but one that was vigilant, and one that could practically kill you if you let him. A few weeks went by, and we hadn't heard anything from the cops, so eventually I tried to stop thinking about it. Another month passed, and although I was a bit scared of being home alone, nothing else seemed to happen. Then we got another visit from the cops. What they told me made my heart sink in my chest, and still gives me chills to this day. They had caught the guys and realized they were stalking me. Yes, guys, plural. There were 2 guys that had apparently been stalking me without my knowledge for months. They had photos of me, they knew my routines, and they pretty much had an idea of when I'd be alone. The police had been fairly adamant that I change my locks, since they caught 2 guys, and there was evidence of a third. We moved shortly after that. I still pass by that house sometimes, when I go to visit friends or do stuff around the area. A chill runs down my spine every time I do. To think that they never caught one of the guys was scary enough. The fact they tried to break into my house was worse. Not to mention that I hadn't even known they were watching me. I still think about it even now, years later. I dread to think what would have happened if my dogs weren't there, and I dread even more about what they had planned if I did open that door, or they had successfully broken in. I thank the universe every day that Vince and Maury were there, especially now. My mom never worked until after dark again after that, which in all honesty, was totally fine with me. This happened to me almost 4 years ago. My parents and my husband were visiting my mom's family in Indianapolis. I used to go all the time as a kid, but I wouldn't know my way around. I was drinking a lot because my husband had an emotional affair with his ex that lasted 4 months. She tried to break us up. Honestly, I could tell a whole story about how she tried to ruin our relationship, but that's for another time. So we saw my family and then went back to the hotel. I was upset, so I said I was going to smoke, but in reality, I was going to the hotel bar. I got multiple double vodka shots with a splash of orange juice. I was feeling good. The bar was closing, so I asked the bartender where there was another bar, and she told me to go to TGI Fridays. It was about a 10-minute walk. Remember, this was after 10 p.m., and I was already drunk. I went inside and got more drinks. I don't remember how exactly I got outside, but I was standing there smoking, and there were people outside in the parking lot with me the whole time. But suddenly, I remember being dragged towards a car. While I felt it happening, I was so inebriated that I couldn't do anything or even realize how bad this situation was quickly getting. During this time, my husband realized I was missing and woke up my mom in my parents' room. They tracked my phone to the Fridays parking lot, but by the time my mother and husband reached the vicinity of my phone, I wasn't anywhere in sight. Just then, my mom saw a man trying to force me into his car. She got out of the Uber they were in and started screaming to let me go. This thought my mom was just a stranger trying to save me. He didn't believe her, and I remember the yelling. Something like, "How do I know she's your daughter?" My mom threatened to call 911 since I was almost in the back of his car. He let go of me then and drove off with his back passenger side door open. I'm convinced that something terrible was awaiting me in the back of that car. I was unfamiliar with the area, I was drunk, and I barely realized how bad the situation was. Due to being drunk, bruised, and unable to account the situation to my family, they took me to the hospital for observation. I was released the next day, and only then did I get the details of what my family saw and what they had to do to rescue me. To the creep who tried to take me while I was drunk, I pray that we never meet. No one with good intentions just grabs a girl the way that you did. So this story took place about a year ago, maybe a little bit more. I was about 19 at the time and going home from university after classes. I usually had my keys with me, but around this time, I had lost them, and my mom had yet to make me a new copy. What this meant was that I was often left locked out of my house if my mom or my siblings weren't home, so I had to find crafty ways of passing the time. After reaching the house and realizing that none of my family members were home, I called my auntie and asked if she would let me hang out at her workplace while I waited. She said it would be fine, and then told me to call an Uber that she'd be paying for as soon as I got there. So that's what I did. I log into the app, key in my destination, and within a few minutes, the Uber car has appeared down the street. I give the driver a wave to confirm that I'm the passenger he's looking for, but I'm met with a blank stare and a rather emotionless man in general. The guy gave me kind of a weird vibe, but I also tend to be paranoid every time I hop in a car that isn't with my family. So I got in, tucked that feeling to the side, rolled down my window, and kept a tight grip on my phone. The drive itself seemed relatively normal until we got to the area where my aunt's workplace was. I'm not completely familiar with the neighborhood, but I do know where you're supposed to turn, and the driver just blew right by it. He said that he was just following the GPS when I asked him about it, but he also didn't have his phone mounted, so I couldn't see the app that he was using. This is the point when doom kinda starts to set in for me. I don't know directions very well, and I could only rely on the driver being a decent person and taking me to where I'm supposed to go. But it's obvious at this point that he's not. Wherever he is taking me, I have no clue. I remember seeing this fountain that I could recognize from when my mom drove me to my uncle's place. But that was way farther from my aunt's place now, and leaving the general vicinity of where I knew that I needed to be. By now, I was kind of thinking of what to do, because this guy drove past a ton of empty houses, and a couple of them even seemed to be still under construction. At this point, I'm doing my best to try and find a place that I can jump out, a stop sign or a stoplight that I can quickly exit the vehicle. But the whole time, he's driving just fast enough that I can't hop out on my own, or I risk falling and hurting myself and becoming even more of a target as I lay in the road. All of a sudden, he then stops near a place that looks like it's about the edge of civilization. We were on a hill, and he slowly turns the car off. I got lucky in so many ways that day, looking back on it now. As he turns around to face me from the driver's seat, my phone begins to vibrate. It's my aunt calling me, and as I pick up, she asks, "Where are you?" I literally felt my heart drop because I had no idea, and this dude was just staring at me now. I said that I didn't know, and I asked him, "Hey, where did you take me?" He replied with, "I wouldn't know what to tell you, kid." That was enough for me. I grabbed my backpack, flung open the door, and yelled aloud, "That's fine, I'll see myself out," and hauled ass like I hadn't in a very long time. So now I'm running down the street, seeking safety from this man as I attempt to put distance between us two. I ask my aunt to stay on the phone with me and not hang up, because I hear his ignition turn over and the car circle around. As I hit the corner, I see an empty lot surrounded by a concrete wall and strong bar gate, but there was just enough space under the gate for me to crawl in. So I chuck my backpack over the fence and crawl under. There's a gigantic electrical box on this property, so I opened it to crouch down and hide inside, my aunt still on the phone with me, now joined by my uncle. They're both asking for my live location through WhatsApp, because I had no idea where I was, and no ability to tell them. Literally, I was in the middle of nowhere. I waited for about 2 hours, and this guy just wouldn't leave. I saw him drive up and down the block what seemed like 50 times. Each time, slower than the last, as I'm sure he was looking for me. At some point, the guy stopped driving by. This was about the time that my uncle got near in his truck. He didn't know where I was exactly, so he kept honking and telling me to tell him when I could hear it. Finally, when I heard it in the distance, I emerged from my hiding space, slid under that gate, and hopped into the cab of my uncle's pickup truck. The feeling of relief was real. For a moment, I thought that maybe this had been a big misunderstanding, and I just jumped out of some guy's car like a maniac. But then when I got home, I checked the app, and what I saw shook me to my core. First, it said that I reached my destination, which obviously I hadn't, and the picture of the driver from the app didn't match the person that I was in the car with, not one bit. I had asked my uncle and aunt not to tell my mom about this, and to let me explain once I saw her. When she picked me up from my aunt's job, I recounted the full story, and we went to go make a copy of that house key right away. Because of course, something almost terrible had to happen in order to get that key. We reported all of this to Uber, and we even made a police report, but to the best of my knowledge, nothing ever came of it. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that my mother won't let me leave the house anymore without making sure that I have a way to get back in. This happened a few years ago. I was a teen, and I grew up on our family's ranch in the middle of nowhere in the southwestern United States. It was a very high elevation area where the Rocky Mountains stand proud, towering over beautiful green plains. Our ranch is about 20 minutes away from a tiny 100-person town, just to give you an idea of how isolated we were. Some family friends were getting married on one icy evening. My family was going to go to the wedding, which was in another town about 45 minutes away. I didn't want to go because my favorite NFL team was playing that night. Go Pats. So they went to the wedding and left me at home alone. I was sitting at home watching the game with my dog. I remembered that I had forgotten to close the horse barn door. So I put on a jacket and grabbed my rifle in case I ran into a bear or cougar or something out there. I went to the barn and kicked the door closed. As I was walking back to the house, I heard the sound of a truck engine traveling through the mountains. I thought, they can't be back so early. That was my first clue that something was amiss. The dirt road to get to the ranch winds down around a hill just before it gets to the house and barns, so you can't see who's coming until they're upon you. I went home and grabbed as many weapons as I could and made sure all the doors and windows were locked out of precaution. I turned off the lights so that whoever it was wouldn't know that someone was home. I peered out the window that was looking towards the dirt road. A few minutes later, I saw headlights coming up the road. I got away from the window so that they wouldn't see me. I saw the headlights were shining through one of the house's windows, the one that I'm ducking under at this point. I prepared for the worst and waited. After a while, I saw the headlights disappear. I heard the truck engine turn off, and I heard a car door open. I heard footsteps walking around the house a few times, stopping near windows and doors. I even heard the front door handle start to jiggle. While that was terrifying in and of itself, the single scariest moment had to be as I look up from my hiding place. I have a flattened out view of the window. I can't see out over the property, but I can see pretty much where the window meets the cold night air. I first see a shadow, then I see hands pressed up against the window, and then I see the window begin to fog, as if somebody outside is breathing directly on it. While I can't see the person, I absolutely know that they're there. Without any further announcement, I hear the footsteps of this person leave the porch and head back towards their vehicle. I hear the car start, and it slowly ease back down the road that it came from. I called the police once my family returned. They took a report, but to this day, they still have no clue who tried to gain entry into our house that night. Another chilling fact is that people don't tend to stumble upon our ranch. We're so far out there that chances are this person had to have been here before. I definitely hope that they don't try to come back again. This all happened exactly a year ago. Shout out to Facebook Memories for reminding me. I lived in a ground floor apartment in a very heavy foot traffic area. It used to be a corner storefront, so the living room windows were huge and only one small one could be opened. I had a very violent upstairs neighbor and even angrier dealers living across the street. I've had to make multiple calls to the police and give statements. Aside from them, the neighborhood was pretty lovely, and I got along well with all of my sane neighbors. One of my cats even became a local celebrity, thanks to a haunted Halloween tour that would stop at my corner every night to tell stories. The second he heard them, he'd run from wherever he was to jump up on the windowsill and listen while they all cooed at him. Anyway, because of the large windows, I didn't have any privacy in my living room. Usually, I didn't mind this because I'm a people watcher, and my cats also love the view. I had blinds and sheer curtains, but you could always still see straight into my apartment. Thankfully, I had plenty of privacy in my bathroom and bedroom. One night, I was sitting at my computer desk in the living room, just watching YouTube and sipping on a beer. I heard a group of people talking outside, but these were normal sounds for the area, and I would have ignored it completely if I didn't hear one of them speaking directly into the window fan in the one open window. "Oh, she's drinking a beer? Doesn't she usually drink whiskey?" I spun around in my chair instantly, and then heard, "Oh shit," She saw us, and scuffling as they ran away. I couldn't see them because it was dark outside, but it sounded like there were at least 2 women and 2 men. I was frozen in place just listening for anything else, like footsteps or their voices again. It took me a while to fully realize what I'd just heard. I do typically prefer to sip on whiskey at night, but that day, I wanted to try a new beer flavor I saw in the store. These people knew my habits well enough to know this. I was also deeply concerned that they knew it was whiskey, since I drank it out of a set of patterned glasses, and there was no way to tell what it was in them. You could see the kitchen from the living room windows, but I often kept my whiskey in the freezer, so they'd have to see me at a specific moment to know what I was drinking. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night, and while I couldn't sleep, I remembered another incident that had happened a few nights prior. I keep my bedroom window open at night because I sleep right under it, and I like the night breezes. There's a bright security light directly across the street, so even with the blinds down, I still have quite a bit of light hitting the opposite wall. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m., which isn't unusual for me, and I turned on a Netflix movie to fall back asleep to. While laying there, I see the shadow of a head and shoulders appear on the wall, and it just stays there for way too long. I'd guess about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, this isn't very common, but people have stopped to smoke a cigarette right outside my window before. The smell gives me an instant headache, but this time there was no smoke or smell of any kind. Someone just standing there. I couldn't tell which way they were facing, but after the recent event, I wondered if someone was looking in while they thought I was sleeping. I told my coworkers about these events, and they were terrified for me. I was actually planning on moving at the end of October and just slowly bringing boxes and furniture to my new place over the course of the month. Once they heard what had happened, they all banded together and got 75% of my things over in one day. I told them all I cared about was my animals and my bed, but they got everything except for the larger furniture and whatever we couldn't box up and move before midnight. I love them all very much and appreciate them every single day. I had a couple of anxiety attacks over this, especially when I had to go back for the last of my stuff, but I felt completely safe in my new place. I also got a full-blown security system with sensors and cameras. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first and ended up not being the last time I was watched and stalked. I still visit the area of my old apartment from time to time because it's a great bar scene. I don't think I'd be able to pick out their voices, but no one's given me weird looks or vibes since then, so I'll cheers to that. I don't often get the chance to share this story, but it seems appropriate in this space. When I was in high school, I entered a relationship with a very close friend of mine named Ivory. After Ivory and I broke up, we stayed good friends. When Ivory's birthday came around, she asked me to come to the birthday party that she was having. The first leg of the evening was at a restaurant that I'd never been to, a few towns over. Afterwards, we would all return to a mutual friend's house for beverages and relaxation. One of Ivory's friends had volunteered to drive us all to the restaurant, but I'd heard plenty of stories about her terrible driving. As a result, I opted to chauffeur myself in my luxurious minivan. Yeah, I drove a minivan in high school. Ivory's friend told me 7 p.m., so at 7 p.m., I rolled into the parking lot. I called Ivory to let her know I had arrived, but they were just leaving. I overheard Ivory tell her friend, "If you tell him 7, he's there at 7. This all meant that I had about a half an hour of boredom before I'd have any company. Being the introvert that I am, I decided not to go inside and wait like a normal person. Instead, I decided to listen to whatever angsty music I was into at the time, probably Heartbeat by Childish Gambino. Moreover, I also didn't park right near the restaurant. The restaurant was located in a plaza, a strip with several other stores along either side. For some reason, I thought it'd be weird for patrons to see me just sitting there like some waiting weirdo. Instead, I parked at the far end of the plaza by a supermarket. I could still see the restaurant, and there were a lot fewer cars on this side of the parking lot. 5 minutes go by. I'm rapidly switching through songs. 10 minutes go by, and I'm bored like a piece of pine in a woodshop class. Out of the abyss of silence, I felt the hum of a text come through. Ivory had texted me. Thank God. A brief reprieve from this boredom. As I'm composing a response, I get this weird feeling. You know that feeling like someone's watching you? Like you can almost hear their eyes? I felt something unnerving, so I looked up from the glow of my phone into the darkness before me. What I saw was a family of 4. There was a woman, her husband, and their 2 kids. All 4 were looking at me intensely. The woman was standing in front of her 2 children, as though to shield them from a proleptic and palpable existential danger. The look in her eyes was of sheer horror, like a waiter had asked her, "Is Pepsi okay?" I've never seen such utter panic so visible on someone's face, and I once had to physically intervene to prevent an armed assailant from attacking someone. The woman slowly crept forward, her family inching behind her. She began moving towards the driver's side, closer to me with each step, and with each step, her terror rising. At this point, I'm beginning to panic, because I have no clue why this woman and her family are snarling at me so aggressively. Without warning, the husband says something I couldn't hear through the glass. He extends his arm and points to his left. His wife, children, and I all simultaneously follow his hand. He was pointing 5 spots to the left of my car, where an almost identical one sat. The mother threw her head back in a single burst of laughter as she unlocked her car. This family had left the grocery store to find a teen dressed in all black sitting in their car. This teen then proceeded to maintain eye contact for what felt like an eternity. My perplexed expression likely appeared as a more sinister one, especially in the dim light of the parking lot. I'm just glad they realized where their car was before anyone got hurt or police got called. So family who thought I was in their car at night, I promise we totally can meet. I'm actually a really nice guy who doesn't steal cars. This is a long one, so I encourage everyone to get a drink and maybe a snack before I begin. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just married my longtime girlfriend. Over the course of our 12-year relationship, we had traveled to the mountains several times in both summer and winter for camping. Naturally, we both agreed that this was how we wanted to spend our first few weeks of our marriage. We booked a 20-day stay at a mountainside campground on the other side of the country. We also decided to bring our dogs with us. They too love being outdoors, and we generally bring them camping anyway. After 2 days of road tripping, we had arrived. We quickly set up and settled in for a long stay on the mountain. It was beautiful. A couple of days into our trip, and we had already met a bunch of fellow campers. We're very experienced campers, so we generally attract a lot of attention from novice campers, asking for tools or supplies as they see we are well set up. We're usually more than happy to help people get situated if they need matches, cream or sugar, or help setting up their own equipment. It was day 4 or 5 when she first made her presence known to us. I will refer to this person as she or her, as we never learned her name. We were sitting down under the shade of a large pine tree at the edge of our site, drinking beers and playing cards, when she seemingly appeared out of nowhere. She just suddenly was right there. "Can I pet your dog?" she said. Even my dogs didn't see her approach, as the very sound of her voice triggered them into a startled frenzy. As the dogs were worked up already, I politely told her no. Then she just stood there, at the edge of our sight. Didn't say a word, just stood there, sort of existing, but not really doing anything. She wasn't exactly staring at us or looking at anything in particular. I asked her if she needed anything, and she said no. After a few minutes of this, she walked off. I work with people with brain injuries, so I've had my fair share of experiences with unusual behaviors, including people with poor social skills. So I wasn't about to write this person off as creepy just yet, but she had my attention. I casually watched her walk off and enter a campsite across the path and a few sites down from ours. There was already a small tent set up in the site, but she proceeded to pull an even smaller single-person tent from her backpack and began setting it up. The day prior, we saw 2 young girls set up the other tent and were clearly the occupants of that site. There was no further interaction with her that day, although we did notice that the owners of the other tent were not around at all that day, and we didn't see them return that night. Well, the next morning, I'm walking to the camp showers to clean up for the day. As I walk past her site, I see she's sitting in her little tent, reading a book. The door to the tent is open. I pay no attention and keep on my way to the shower. When I'm done with my shower and walking back, I notice her tent is now closed, but it's jiggling about, so I knew that someone was in there. Then she made her presence known, in a big way. Just as I'm approaching her site on the way to mine, she unzips her tent, and I immediately see that she's completely nude. She then positions herself just inside the tent at the door, and lets out this over-the-top, full-body stretch, and held her arms way up in the sky, while pushing her chest forward like it was some kind of mating ritual designed just for me. It was pretty obvious she was putting on a show for me. I continue on my way to my site and tell my wife about the display I had just been witness to. We both laugh it off and move on with our plans to day hike a good trail to a waterfall. The trailhead for this hike was accessible from the campgrounds, so we didn't have to drive to get there. We just walked the 2 additional kilometers to the trail. We walked at a good pace, so when we got to the trail, we decided to stop for a few minutes and take some photos of the surrounding mountains before heading into the thicker bush. After sitting there for maybe 5 minutes, while my wife is taking pictures, she emerges from the trail that leads towards the campground. At first I thought, okay, coincidence. She's staying here, and this is a pretty common trail. But then she sees that I see her, and she stops dead in her tracks and just stands there. Same demeanor as our first encounter. Just standing, not doing anything in particular, but also sending creepy vibes our way. This was the first time I said to my wife, I think we have a stalker. Confused, my wife then looks to where I'm looking and is immediately a little creeped out herself. Once again, I think, whatever, maybe she's just hiking the trail. No big deal. So we continue on the trail at a good pace, and she maintains a consistent distance behind us. Our dogs at this point are a little distracted by her, and our youngest dog keeps turning around to watch her. I got a little fed up with the dog constantly stopping to look back, so I decided that we would stop for some water and let this woman pass. Well, what does she do? But fucking stop walking when we stop, and once again, just stands there. Okay, so now we are genuinely concerned, because this is approaching horror/suspense movie level creep, and I start to wonder what this girl's intentions are. Standing motionless at that distance and refusing to pass us just ramped up the oh shit factor to about a 9. So my wife and I agree to cut the hike short by taking the shorter loop, which was only another ½ kilometer ahead, and then head back to our camp. We managed to get some distance between us by jogging every time we would make a turn, and she was out of sight. We didn't see her again until later that night. That night, my wife decided to take an evening shower at the camp showers. When she returned to our camp, she tells me our stalker was in the bathrooms, also taking a shower. This time, she was with 2 other girls, and appeared to be getting ready for a night at the club. There's a nearby ski town that has a few nightclubs and bars, so it was reasonable to see the girls getting ready for a night out. The 2 girls she was with were the 2 we saw previously set up at her site. My wife explains that she quickly picked up on the fact that the 2 girls and our stalker friend were not well known to each other. It was clear that the 2 girls were close friends with plans to go out partying, and our stalker was making an attempt to be friends and sort of invited herself to join them in their night out. Now we know the ski town well, and the girls kept reinforcing that they were meeting at a specific restaurant before going to the bar. It was currently 10:30 p.m., and we know the restaurant they're telling her to go to was closed at 10. They were lying to her about their plans. The stalker kept asking them, "Are you sure this place? Are you sure?" They convinced her, and she then left to her tent to finish getting ready, while the 2 friends stayed in the bathroom to finish their makeup. My wife went on to explain how after she left, the 2 friends were mocking and making fun of our stalker. They were young 20-somethings, acting like little girls in elementary school. My wife has no time for that. Creepy stalker or not, she had to say something to the girls for their behavior. My wife calls them out. Well, putting all the catty bullshitting aside, the girls explained to my wife that the stalker had set up her tent on their site when they were staying with a friend in the ski town. When they returned, they found her living at their site without invitation. She had just taken it upon herself to take a little corner of their site without knowing them at all. The girls said they were upset with her and trying to make her feel uncomfortable so she would leave, but she just wouldn't leave. My wife asked them why they didn't just report her to the park warden. The excuse that they gave was they were leaving the next day and didn't want to make a huge deal out of it. So whatever happened between them, the fake late dinner plans and clubbing, is unknown to us. About 3 a.m. that same night, we're all awoken to a blood-curdling scream right outside of our camper. At first, I was like, holy shit, that must be a wild animal. My wife is trembling, dogs barking. I'm startled, but curious. I peel back the window cover to see her standing motionless on the path outside of our trailer. I had the window cover down maybe 8 to 10 centimeters when she appears to make direct eye contact with me. My heart rate is jacked. After gazing in my general direction for what seemed like an eternity, she calmly turns around and walks to her tent. I go make sure our trailer is locked. After a good hour and a stiff whiskey, we manage to get back to sleep. So the next day is a Friday. We have friends from a nearby major city coming up to the mountains to spend the weekend with us. We haven't seen them in a while, so we're excited for a couple days together. Well, they're not at our site for 15 minutes, and as they're setting up their tent, she mysteriously appears out of nowhere yet again. Like bam, there she is. But now this time, she's actually in our site. I hadn't had a chance to tell our friends about her before she arrived, so they were a little more friendly than I was. She asked me once again if she can pet my dog, who during all of this is barking right at her. I think I said something like, "She isn't being very friendly towards you, so I would prefer if you didn't." She didn't pet my dog, but she also just stood there staring at me, like she was considering how she would dismember my limbs. She then notices our friend's tent as he's still setting it up, and comments on how it's the same model as hers. My buddy has picked up on the creep vibes and my general displeasure with her, so he gives her a, "Oh yeah? Cool," and keeps setting up. Well, she starts grabbing at the tent pegs and picks up the hammer and says she'll help him set it up because she has experience with it. My buddy declines and asks for his tools back. Cue the psychopath stare down, but this time she has a hammer in her hand, adding to that oh shit factor. She literally just drops everything right there and runs off. I go on to explain the last few days to our friends, and they agree that we need to keep an eye on her. So by this time, the 2 girlfriends whose site she had hijacked were packed up and gone. It's now Friday night, and we've been drinking all day, so we're feeling pretty good. It's maybe about 11 p.m. when she walks over to our site again. She says, "Hey, You guys seem to have a lot of extra room with the tent and the camper. Do you think I could stay with you guys tonight? We could have a lot of fun in here together. My buddy is feeling pretty good from all the day's beers, so he's pretty forward when he replies, "Did you just propose a gangbang to us?" Now this whole time I'm just sitting in my camp chair with my whiskey taking this all in. She hadn't really taken notice to me at all so far. But then, she smiles, turns her head and looks directly at me, and says, "I like your friend." She then turns around and walks away into the darkness of night, towards the forest. What in the f***? We're all now terrified she's going to return. I decided right then and there, if we see her again in a creepy fashion, I'm calling the park warden. Well, the night is winding down, so we all decide to walk together to the bathrooms to clean up for bed. My wife pulls on my hoodie and says, "Babe, look." I look over to see that the site she was set up on is completely destroyed. Stuff everywhere. Garbage, clothing, food, everywhere. I thought, okay, this is weird. Could this have been a bear? No, we would have heard it. I then noticed that the tent is gone. She's gone and left the campsite a complete mess. As luck would have it, the park patrol was completing their fire rounds and were at the messed up site when we were returning from the bathroom. We told them there was a girl staying there who was acting erratic, and we suspected she was squatting on the site based on our conversation with the two girls from earlier in the week. We didn't see her again for the rest of our trip until the very last full day. There's a great little lookout point not far from our site, which has amazing views of the river and valley below, and it was the perfect evening to see the sunset behind the mountains. It was a lovely final send-off to an otherwise beautiful honeymoon. Just when we thought we were done with her, she emerged once again from seemingly nowhere. We were sitting on a couple of chairs that are bolted in place at the viewpoint, taking pictures of the valley below. As my wife is looking through the viewfinder on the camera, she picks up on the woman in the distance. She's standing in the woods a little ways down the mountain, watching us. As her final act, she walked up the mountainside and sat right beside us on a boulder that was beside the chairs. She says nothing, just sits there. My wife has the brilliant idea of asking me to take one last picture of the scenery, and she gives me a little wink. I pick up on her idea right away, and I position myself so this woman is going to be in the picture. My wife wanted this lady's photo in the event something bad happens with her before we can leave the area. We took our final looks out at the beautiful scenery and headed to our camp for the night. We didn't see or hear from her again. Upon reflection, we agreed this woman had some serious mental health issues. She had zero social skills, and we did witness her attempt to make friends with those two girls that shafted her in a terrible way. That being said, she did things way beyond the realm of acceptable social awkwardness. There were moments I thought she would pull out a knife and kill us. More than that, the stalking, the midnight screaming, and running off into the woods at night was terrifying to us, and I feel a story worthy of this sub. I do have the photo on a thumb drive somewhere, and we'll see about uploading a pixelated photo if it's appropriate. To anyone else, the picture just looks like a person sitting in the shot. But to us, it's a reminder of our wild adventure and the start to our amazing marriage. This utterly bizarre experience happened to me and my family just about a month ago. I'm 15, and I was playing some video games before passing out one night. I'd say it was about 11 p.m. when I hear the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I begin walking downstairs. But about halfway there, rationality comes to mind. Who the hell rings a doorbell at 11 p.m.? I silently strode back upstairs and stood in the hallway, kind of expecting something bad to happen. An exact minute later, it rings twice again. My parents begin to leave their room and give me a quizzical look, and all I could do to respond was shrug. Then, banging on the door begins. My mother jumps at the first bang, and my father's eyes widen. But more in confusion than fear, he decided to go downstairs and look through the peephole, only to see our neighbor. My dad hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice tremble slightly. "Hey, what do you need?" Next thing I hear is an entire full-blown scream argument from our neighbor, claiming that this house, our house, was his, and that we stole it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door without giving our neighbor the time of day. My dad made it back to the stairs to head back to his room when our neighbor first hit the door again. I'm not talking banging with his fist. This man was full body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second, and our neighbor charged the door again. This time, we began to hear the splintering of wood. Everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body. My mother went to go get my two siblings, and I went for the phone to call 911. The body slamming ensued for another 5 minutes, and while I was on the phone with the dispatcher, it stopped. I thought it was over, and I was relieved, but I still stuck on the phone. I go peek out the front window of my house and see that it was only getting started. Our neighbor took his Jeep Wrangler and directed it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was doing until he hit the gas and we heard the squealing of tires. Then, the immediate sound of brakes. He was trying to scare us out of the house. I was still on the phone with 911, and I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes and such. Eventually, the police arrive and quickly arrest him. The next morning, I left for school, still shaken from the night before. I stepped onto our front steps and saw tire marks leading up to our front door. The lunatic actually nearly rammed our door down with his car. I really never want to see this guy again, but he lives directly to our right. Fuck my life. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest. My parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend, only emerging to come out for school on Monday morning. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on a movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were just kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods, just near the tracks, and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun that we did it multiple times. Never had a single problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we both were in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd line up drinks at the bar, or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and then walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy, and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, We had a map, so I gave a "what the hell," and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and then moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood at the top of the place, also weathered and black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks, go to sleep, and move on in the early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting any louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, although it was nearly pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we certainly didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing, it was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way that it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field's length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the f*** out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out that open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us on the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me out in those woods. I was about 10 years old when this happened, and even 20 years after the fact, I'm still so freaked out by the event and the lack of response from the adults in my life. I lived in an oceanside town as a child and had a pretty nice upbringing. My family owned the house that we lived in. We were a mile or two from the beach, and things were nice. Not to say we were supremely well off or anything. I mean, there was a Walmart across the street from my neighborhood after all. But all things considered, like I said, things were nice. One lazy afternoon, me and my best friend Daisy decided to go for a walk to the beach. Our parents weren't the most overbearing people. So long as we went together, we were good to go on these unsupervised walks. Within 20 or 30 minutes, we get to the beach and make it to the water's edge. At this point, we weren't content to just hang out there. We wanted to continue our walk along the shore. We made the executive decision to take off our shoes and bury them so that we could feel the wet sand under our toes, and we'd be able to get our shoes on the walk back. No biggie. So off we go, down the beach, talking and laughing, and just generally enjoying the day. I'm not sure how long it took, but we made it a fair distance with our stroll. Thinking back with my adult brain, it was probably about a mile or so from where we dropped our shoes. I had brought a set of binoculars with me so that Daisy and I could peer out to the horizon of the ocean and see if we could see boats or whales or whatever 10-year-olds think they're going to see out on the water. So at this point, I take the binoculars that are draped around my neck and put them up to my eyes as I scan the water, the dunes, and down the beach back from where we came. When my eyes come to rest on the beach, however, something came into focus that just didn't seem right. There was a man some distance away. I could tell it was a man based on his physique and his walk. Not sure how old, what ethnicity, or any of that, but I knew it was a man. He was walking in our direction, and he was maybe 200 or 300 feet away. Although it wasn't a very popular beach, it wasn't uncommon to see another person while out there. The thing that gave me pause was the fact that from head to toe, he was pretty much all the same color, save for his head and, the area below his belt. It was about this point that my brain caught up with my eyes, and I realized that this man was completely naked. Naked and walking towards us. After I tell Daisy what I see, she says that she can see him too, and she confirms just how weird this is. In that same moment, this man, who obviously had already seen us, raises his arm and points directly at us, before he takes off at a full sprint, heading right for us. Daisy and I instantly freak out as the gravity of the situation hits us like a ton of bricks. What was just weird and slightly confusing a moment ago had now devolved into terrifying, and we knew that we had to get off that beach right then. But where to go? We can't continue down the beach because it stretches on for days, and surely this full-grown man will be able to track us down. We can't run back in the direction that we came from because the beach isn't wide enough to avoid him, and we'd essentially be running straight towards danger. So we decide to run up the sand dune directly behind us in an attempt to distance ourselves from our nude pursuer. This dune is not meant for walking. It's covered in sticks, ice plant. It's at a rather steep angle, and wouldn't be the easiest if you weren't freaking out about being caught by somebody chasing you. But we have to brave it. We make the dash and urge each other up this hill, not pausing for a moment as our bare feet step on logs, prickly plants, and anything between us and safety. As we crest the hill, we see that this man has made up considerable ground on us, now only about 50 to 75 feet behind us, as he begins this climb as well. We sprint down the other side and hit the walking path that borders a highway with dozens of cars flying by. We know that this man is just about to pop over the hill, so we find an area right off the path that we think conceals us, but still allows us to see what this man's next move would be. Our thought was that even if he got to the top of the dune, he would have to stop in his tracks unless he wanted hundreds of people driving down the freeway to see his junk. As he gets to the top of the hill, he pretty much does just that. He stops, but not before he gazes down in our direction. Not sure if he saw us, or if it was just the fear that he would, but I still remember the feeling of my heart dropping. After what felt like minutes of looking in our direction, he slowly retreated down the side of the hill that he had just come from, and when his head was no longer visible, we took off running down the walking path back in the direction that we started our journey from. We knew we couldn't go back down to the beach, so we sprinted as fast as we could back towards civilization that we knew the path would dump us out on. As we get back to surface streets, we run across the main road, not even waiting for a crossing signal to get to the first business that we see. I think it was a gas station. This was the 90s, so neither one of us kids had a cell phone, and we had to plead with the attendant to use their phone to call our parents. I remember in the heat of the moment, I had incredible anxiety surrounding the fact that we didn't have shoes on, and the gas station may not even let us in, because I was familiar with the sign saying no shoes, no shirt, no service. The attendant took pity on us, although I'm not sure she even knew what we were breathlessly trying to tell her. So we call our parents to come and get us, and there's finally a feeling of relief that we were not going to be caught by some creep wanting to do only God knows what to two 10-year-olds. When my parents arrived, they loaded me and Daisy into the car, and they asked what happened, how did we end up at the gas station, and where our shoes were. Through tears at this point, we begin to recount the whole ordeal, seeing this strange man, being chased, making our escape, and ultimately calling them from the gas station of refuge. My parents called the police, and they had a car meet us at the house to make a report. But to my shock, even as a 10-year-old, the police officer simply said, "Oh yeah, there's an unofficial nude beach down there. You probably should just avoid that area." Like, really? That's all you got from this entire story? After the police left, my parents took me back to where our walk began on the beach to retrieve the shoes that we assumed were still buried, because Lord forbid we were to lose our Skechers to the ocean. We get to the path, and I tell my mom that I don't want to go back down there. What if that man was still there? What if he were to try to get me again? My mom assured me that things would be fine, and that man would be wise not to pop up now that my parents were there with me. This put my concerns to rest, although just for a moment, because as we got closer to the spot that I remembered Daisy and myself digging a hole to conceal our kicks, there was now an open trench and no shoes to be found. The thing that brought terror flooding back through me was that there were articles of men's clothing strewn nearby that I knew for a fact hadn't been there when we left that location earlier in the day. We never saw that man again, thank goodness. But at 10, it scared me to death thinking that he had my shoes, and he might somehow be able to find me with them, like the most twisted, sinister version of Cinderella ever told. So this happened in 2013, and I was 17 at the time. My family was looking at this house, and the owner showed up and talked with my parents. He seemed like a nice older man, built the house himself. It's a pretty nice 2-story house overlooking a river. Anyway, I was standing back, watching everyone talk, and as the owner is talking and laughing, there's a break in the conversation where he turns away from my parents, and his expression completely and instantly changes from happy to the most sinister and hateful scowl I've ever seen. I don't think he noticed me watching. It probably appeared as if I was on my phone because my head was down. As soon as he turned back, he instantly went back to smiling. It was so creepy and honestly made me feel sick to my stomach. I told my mom, who said admittedly it was weird, but likely that the man is just awkward. So we got the house. We moved in, and the next weekend my family is going to church, but I don't feel like going. So they all leave me at home. It's Sunday morning, about 11 a.m., when I hear really loud banging outside. It's rhythmic and coming from the side of the house. I was on the other side of the house myself, on the second floor. Honestly, my dumbass thought it was maybe the wind. It was stormy that day after all. And I didn't think much of it. It stopped after about 5 to 10 minutes. But a few minutes later, I hear walking around downstairs. Chairs moving, kitchen cabinets opening, and the fridge being opened and shut. I immediately, quietly, go lock my door and grab my baseball bat and begin to call 911. While I tell them my address, I text my mom and tell her that someone is at the house and that I've called 911. At this point, the operator said that someone was about 10 minutes out. I tell her to shh because I heard footsteps walking towards the stairs. Basically, the house is so thin that I could track the intruder step by step as they move through it. At this time, my mom responded that she's on her way, but she's 30 minutes away at this point. So there I am, 17-year-old, 5'2", 100-pound girl hunkered in her room, knowing full well that if this intruder came in, he'd likely overpower me and take the bat. I was f***ing terrified. I heard him walk down the hallway towards my door. I saw the handle turn and stop. It was locked, but I heard him stand there. He didn't move. I could even hear his breathing. It felt like forever, but really I think it was about 10 seconds. I heard him turn around and go back down the stairs. I heard the back door open and shut one more time, and about 3 minutes later, the police pull up. The 911 operator asked me if I could let them in, or if they needed to force it. I knew he had left, so I let them in. No one was there. No sign of forced entry. Nothing. When my mom got there, she looked at my stepdad and asked if he had changed the locks. but he hadn't. I think the creepiest part, and what really validated my story, was that my mom had just vacuumed the hallway, and there were now visible, large footprints up and down the hall that were bigger than any of my family members' feet. The police hadn't been up there, and they just stopped outside of my room. I suspect that it was the original homeowner, but he died about a year after that, and we could never confirm that it was him. But my suspicions, they'll never die. This happened to me about 2 days ago. I live in a small city in Romania, about 30,000 inhabitants. Romania isn't exactly known for their tolerance of gay people. It's not as bad as other places in the world, but the situation is definitely not rosy here. I get on Grindr and meet a guy, 18 years old apparently. The guy didn't have a picture of his face as his PFP because it's too dangerous. He had a picture of a rose drawing. Most guys on Grindr here don't have pictures of themselves, so it wasn't weird. We talked for a bit, and I really liked the guy. So we decide to exchange face pictures. I send him a selfie, and he sends me a picture of himself, and it happens to be a guy from our city that I've seen around once or twice. He was cute, and I really liked him now. So I told him, "Hey, I've seen you around. I didn't know you were gay too." We talk, and finally arranged to meet up. I had some errands to run at the tailor shop. My cousin's bachelorette party is coming up next week, and I had to adjust my favorite shirt. So I asked him to meet in front of the tailor shop later that day. The building in which the tailor shop is located has 4 stories. The ground floor is a clothes shop, which my aunt works at. The first floor is a storage room. The 3rd floor is a barber salon, and the 4th floor was a tailor shop. So I go to the tailor shop, and then go to the clothes shop on the ground floor to visit my aunt and see how she's doing. As I was looking out the window of the clothes shop, I noticed that there were 5 men, all of them in their late 20s, behind the building. None of them was the guy that I got a picture of, and none of them even looked remotely close to what the guy looked like. I texted the guy I was supposed to meet and asked him if he made it to the tailor shop. As soon as I send the message, one of the 5 guys' phones lit up, and he started texting. As soon as he stopped texting, I got a notification from Grindr. "I'm behind the tailor shop. I went there to smoke so no one would see me. Come smoke with me." I was terrified as I realized I wasn't going to meet the guy in the picture. He tries to get me to go behind the tailor shop, and I try to get him to the side of it. There were no windows to the side of the building, so after a few tries, he agreed to meet at the side of the tailor shop. All 5 guys went to the side. I peeked my head from the door, looked left, looked right, and when I saw that the coast was clear, I ran for it. I'm not sure what those 5 guys had planned, but I felt in my gut that it was nothing nice, so I'm glad that I listened to that feeling. The silver lining side note to all of this is that I bumped into the cute guy whose picture I had received a few days later and started talking to him. I opened my phone up and pretended to use it as I went on to Grindr. I saw him look at my screen and ask, "You're, you know." I say, "Yes." He looks back at me and says, "Me too." I told him about the incident, and he got kind of scared, as the guys used his picture, but it didn't stop him from accepting a dinner invite from me. We go out next week. For about 6 months last year, I lived in the north of Spain. About a week before I was going to move back to Ireland, my friend and I were at my house having dinner and drinking a little. I was renting an apartment in the city, and my roommate was an older lady, maybe in her 50s. I'm 20 just for the story's sake. That night, my roommate left to go have dinner with her friends. About a minute after she left, someone buzzed our door to be let into the building. I looked at the camera, but it was a woman that I didn't recognize. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, so I just assumed it was one of my roommate's friends, and she was coming to meet her, or something like that. I buzzed her into the building, assuming they would meet in the lobby. At first, I didn't buzz her in, because I didn't recognize her. and she began to walk away from the door just about the instant that I hit the buzzer myself. I then looked away from the camera, so I couldn't see if she actually entered or not. I just assumed that if she didn't enter, she would call or text my roommate and they'd meet up as scheduled. Boy, I was wrong. This woman came up to the 6th floor of my building, and she parked herself in front of my apartment. She came up just 2 minutes after my roommate left, so I know she didn't take the stairs. And I know they must have seen each other when my roommate got off the lift, and the lady happened to get in. Realizing that this is weird, I don't open the door when she rings it. I look through the peephole just to confirm that it was nobody that I knew, and I verified that this woman is no acquaintance of mine. She's a full-blown stranger. At this point, I back away from the door, and I gesture for my friend to be silent. We creep back to my room, which is at the far side of the apartment, and I begin calling my roommate who isn't picking up. Meanwhile, the lady is incessantly ringing my doorbell. My roommate isn't picking up, and my friend is just telling me to open the door. In her mind, it's a woman, so she must be harmless. I call her an idiot for underestimating the female sex. Women can be criminals too, after all. She keeps telling me to open the door, but I refuse, using my better judgment. The door keeps ringing though, and I look out the peephole once more. At this point, I understand that if she knew my roommate or was looking for someone specific, she would just call or text them. She never took out a phone. She just stayed eerily silent, didn't call out any names or ask if anyone was home. This whole situation was freaking me out. I finally get through to my roommate. She says that she wasn't expecting anyone and that she doesn't know anyone in that age range. She asks if I'm okay, and I reply that I'm fine. Now it's been at least 20 minutes. I know the lady knows someone is home because the lights are on, and my best bet is that that's why she's not leaving. I continue watching her through the peephole, and I see her go into the lift for a moment, and then come back out again. The lift is really loud, and I would have heard it move, but it didn't. She just went in and came back out again. In my mind, this means someone's in the lift waiting for her, and this screams sketchy to me. After about 40 minutes, she finally leaves. I run to the hall and flick on the outside camera. The lady left the building with 2 large men in tow. They all had backpacks on, and the men looked to be wearing masks. I will forever be grateful for trusting my instincts and not listening to my loudmouth friend. Sometimes, it's just better to be safe than sorry. I'm glad to say that I never saw the creepy lady or her henchmen ever again, and I'm truly glad that we didn't ever have to meet. This entire situation happened to me back in December of 2019, although I still think about it on a daily basis because it was unlike any experience I had ever had before. I hope it offers some sort of enlightenment on what to do/not to do if you find yourself in a similar situation. So back then, I had ventured out to do a bit of late night shopping. I'm a 31-year-old stay-at-home mom of 2 young children, so once my husband gets home from work, I like to take some time to myself and go shopping, take a drive, or run errands, kid-free. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I arrived at the Target that I frequent. I'm by no means a paranoid or anxious individual, but I have attended several seminars on human trafficking and have done plenty of research on my own, learning to identify red flags and what precautions to take when out in public alone, especially at night. I carry several self-defense items on my person at all times, just in case of situations like those. I parked directly in front of the store, next to a cart caddy, and took a mental note of the vehicles parked nearby, again, just as precaution. I was taught at an early age to always be observant of your surroundings, and being a control freak just naturally makes you that way. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night, and the parking lot was actually quite empty, most likely because it was a weekday. As I entered the store, I began browsing like usual, following the natural flow of the store departments, following the main aisle around. I had been browsing for only 10 to 15 minutes when I noticed a young gentleman in his mid-20s. He was tall, skinny, dressed in a dirty gray two-piece sweatsuit and brown work boots. He looked over at me. I smiled and said hello, but his facial expression was blank. He looked like he may have been high on something by the look in his eyes, but he didn't seem to care for my gesture, and he quickly moved on. At first glance, there was nothing in particular that alarmed me about him, except I took notice at the fact that he was just wandering down the main aisle with no cart or basket, hands in his pockets, and didn't seem to be with anyone. I continued shopping with no second thought and made my way to the next department. Several minutes had passed, and that's when I noticed a second young gentleman wearing the same gray sweatsuit and a similar pair of work boots. Again, no cart or basket. He too glanced at me, then quickly darted his eyes away when he realized I was looking directly at him. I became a bit more alert, but still remained composed and continued on browsing. Another 15 minutes or so passed, and that's when a third older man caught my attention. And you guessed it, same gray sweatsuit, work boots, no cart, no basket, just his hands in his pockets. I assumed they were in some sort of work uniform, maybe construction workers, but why weren't they walking together? And why didn't they have any items to purchase? At this point, it was difficult to focus on browsing. I had a bad feeling about these three men, and it became clear that something was a bit off. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I felt as if I was being monitored by the three of them, as if they were all communicating my whereabouts as I continued to make my way through the store. Because each department I entered, it didn't take long for me to notice one of the three men pass by whatever side of the aisle I happened to be in, making their presence known to me. I stayed completely vigilant while trying not to panic or allow my suspicions to overwhelm me. Something about their presence felt very heavy and dark, so I decided to test their intentions, to prove I wasn't overthinking the situation, and to validate my bad gut feeling. I began picking random aisles and traveling back and forth between departments in a very unorganized and random fashion to see if the men would continue to pass by me as frequently as they had been. With every aisle I popped into, it would only take a few moments for one of them to make an appearance, staring me down as they passed by. It felt as if I was being surrounded like a wild animal, hunted even. They were no longer trying to be inconspicuous, which was the scariest part of it all, and everything instinctual was screaming at me to get out of there. I gripped my cart so tightly and figured that if they got too close, I could use the cart to push them away, or at least create distance between us. By this point, I had been shopping for about an hour altogether, maybe a bit over, and was ready to purchase my items. But honestly, I felt too uncomfortable to continue browsing even if I wanted to. The men had been following me all this time, and I was becoming more concerned and annoyed if I'm being honest. The store was pretty empty around this time, one of the main reasons that I like shopping at night, but that made this particular situation even more unsettling. Two preteen girls were wandering around by themselves, which quickly caught my attention because the men had passed them by making similar advances, but the girls were seemingly oblivious to it. So I quietly got their attention and asked them to go find their parents and to stay with them, trying not to freak them out. The mother in me was in full protection mode. I couldn't imagine having my young children with me on this night. Thank God they were home safe and sound. As I made my way to the checkout, I noticed one of the men coming up from behind me, walking at a quicker pace this time, so I immediately stopped and turned to lock eyes with him as he approached. I will never, ever forget the darkness in his eyes. An eerie smirk formed over his face as he nudged past my shoulder, continuing to stare me down, walking backwards to hold his sinister gaze as he exited the store. I had lost sight of the other two men, and I hated the uncertainty of it all. He made his message clear in that very moment. My stomach dropped, and my entire body began to shake. It was a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a kid getting lost in the supermarket, a feeling of desperation. I quickly walked to the checkout, discreetly asked the cashier if I could speak to a manager, and told them what had happened over the last hour, politely asking for a male employee to walk me out to my car and for them to alert their security team members. When I told the manager what happened, her face sunk as if she had already known about these men, and once I described them, she confirmed that she knew who I was talking about. She expressed that several of the female employees had found the men unsettling in the past, and reassured me that someone would escort me to my car. She made a report about the incident and said she would alert the authorities. I was still shaking, but I felt relieved that she believed me and showed concern for the other young female patrons in the store. She took my information, and then a young male employee walks me out to my car. What I saw as I exited the store made me sick to my stomach, as it solidified all of my suspicions. A white, windowless van was parked in the lot directly behind my car, about a 3 parking space distance between us. One of the men seated in the driver's seat, and the other 2 leaning against the side of the van facing my car, attempting to hide out of view. I mean, how cliche and obvious can you be? Your license plate might as well read, Lady Snatchers. Whatever their intent, it didn't seem pure. I pointed them out to the male employee and said, "There they are," which then prompted the men to scurry into the van and speed out of the parking lot without hesitation. I truly don't know what would have happened if I walked out to my car alone, and I'm so freaking grateful I made it home safe and lived to tell my story. Over the following week, I had heard there were several abduction attempts in the shopping center parallel to that target, and I'm almost certain it was the same individuals. I have no concrete confirmation of this, but in my heart of hearts, I feel that it would have been very likely for me to be one of those abduction attempts if I didn't listen to my gut. So to start, I'm a transgender woman. I'm single, and I make my status as trans very clear on all my dating profiles, except Plenty of Fish, because they consider that to be talking about sex, and they will straight up ban you for it. So I state that instead, I'm a huge proponent of trans rights. So this guy messages me on POF. He lives about an hour away. Kinda cute in a mildly creepy way. Like, something seems just a little off about him. But people can't help how they look. So I decided to give him a chance, just like I would want someone to do for me. I discover that he's a smoker, but he says he's trying hard to quit, and only does it when he's really stressed or upset. We have a nice conversation, and he finally asks for my number. Without thinking about it, I give it to him, but I tell him that I'm getting ready for my evening classes, so I'll be slow to respond. A few minutes go by, and I get, "Hi, it's username from POF." Now usually, I send a standard quick message. "Hi, it's Allie. So just to be clear, since my profile might be a little vague, I'm a transgender woman. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, so if you're not interested, I completely understand." About 20% of the time, the guy isn't interested and gets rude and needs to be blocked. The other 80% is split between immediate inappropriate questions and dick pics, casual acceptance, or dead silence. But like I said, I was getting ready to go to class, so I hadn't even sent the message yet. A few minutes go by, and I'm about to text him my standard, when I get another text. "Who the fuck is full dead name? Why is he paying your cell phone bill?" Me. "Where did you even get that name?" Him. "Answer the question. Who is he?" I'm honestly stunned at this point. I realize he must have paid one of those shady websites that offer personal info for a fee. Well, if you must know, I'm transgender, and that used to be my name. I was about to tell you when you pulled that stunt. Please do us both a favor and lose my number. That's incredibly invasive of you, and I don't want to talk to you anymore. Do you still live at my address at the time? In hometown? I'm coming to see you so we can talk about this in person. Me lying. No, I moved a few months ago, and I'm getting ready to head out like I said. You need to leave me alone. Don't contact me again. Him. Since you have something to hide, I'm going to run a full background check on you. You lied to me, and I don't appreciate that. Me. I'm sending screen caps of this conversation, your POF profile and your photos to my 2 best friends who work in law enforcement in your town, and my ex-boyfriend who I'm still on good terms with, who works at the local sheriff's office. Don't text me again. I didn't hear anything else from him for a few weeks. I made sure my doors and windows were locked, and the aforementioned friends and ex would check up on me from time to time. Eventually, it just became one of those weird things that makes you laugh uneasily. And then one day, I thought I saw him at the local grocery store. Same dark hair, thick glasses frames, and just a creepy guy staring at me, watching me as I shopped. I texted my ex about it, and as an upswing on things, my ex and I got back together in a casual sort of way, and he stayed the night a few times a month off and on. One night, when I was alone though, I just kept getting this weird feeling and smelling smoke. I lived in a little apartment complex that were 3 separate apartments that shared walls, but no plumbing or air ducts. I don't smoke, and I'm very sensitive to the smell, thanks to asthma. The apartment had a wall AC unit, so I turned it off since it was apparently pulling air in from a neighbor's guest, who must have been chain smoking. Or so I thought. I had an ASL video due the next morning, so I was up all night practicing and recording the video, signing the same story over and over until it was almost a dance rather than narration. A couple of times I had to restart the video because my cat was going nuts. Finally, around 7 a.m., I had the video finished and sent in, so I was ready for bed. I double-checked all the doors and windows, set an alarm, and went to sleep. I woke up and got ready for school, but was running a bit late and had to hurry out the door. But I noticed something weird, although I didn't have time to stop and register it. Classes went smoothly. I got an A on my ASL video, and I stopped for groceries on my way home. As I reached my front door, I saw what had been bugging me earlier. Each apartment had a small garden on each side of the porch. Mine was nothing but gravel and pavers the previous tenant had put in, but it was tidy, except for a pile of cigarette butts that looked like someone had dumped their car ashtray in my garden. There was no other trash, just that pile, right in front of my bedroom window. I don't think anything about it at first. I just get a broom and a dustpan and sweep it up. As I'm doing it, my neighbor, who's an old man, comes out and asks if my boyfriend ever got a hold of me. I ask him what he means. He tells me there was a young man waiting for me on my porch off and on for a few hours last night, that he'd seen the guy around before and thought he was my boyfriend. I asked what he looked like. Dark hair, thick glasses, chain smoking. I text the on-again, off-again ex. Cops take statements, and I give them the screenshots. I moved out of state a few weeks later for unrelated reasons, and have legally changed my name since, with closed records. I don't give guys my number anymore. Ladies in my fellow queer family, use a texting app until you get to know someone, because for like $5, creeps on the internet can learn everything about you from those 7 digits. When I was 19, in the early 90s, my brother and his wife were newly married and living in Baltimore. I was from Maryland, but had not yet spent time in that city. I knew it wasn't totally safe in parts, but I also knew that I was just going straight to my brother and sister-in-law's house, so it would be fine. Until I turned onto the wrong street. This was MLK Boulevard, and back then, it was a stretch of abandoned gas stations, sketchy bars, boarded up houses. A few people were walking in the middle of the street, drinking out of paper bags. I knew that I had messed up, and instead of freaking out and getting more lost, I pulled into an abandoned gas station. There was a bank of payphones, and I parked about 10 feet from them, hopped out, and called my brother. He was impatient at first, because he knew the city quite well, although it was my first time driving in it, and I was trying to write down his directions as he gave them to me. Just then, something caught my eye, and I looked over at my car. 3 men were leaning against it, 2 on the passenger side, 1 against the driver's side front door. They were all staring at me with their arms crossed. I started to silently cry, thankful that I had sunglasses on. My brother heard me sniffling and said, "Why are you upset? I'm giving you directions." But I couldn't tell him what was going on, as the men were within earshot. I got the rest of the directions, put them in my pocket, and walked to my car. The man leaning against my front door reached up and wiped the tears from one cheek. And then he said, "Why are you crying, baby? Nothing bad has happened yet." Without even thinking about it, I responded, full sobbing now. "I just shot my boyfriend, and I'm in a lot of trouble. The cops are." That's all I got out. The 3 men had all taken off in separate directions at full sprints, just to get away from me. If I hadn't been gifted with that lie from my guardian angels, or whomever saved my ass that day, who knows what would have happened. I no longer live in Maryland, and I may never have a use for that lie again, but I encourage anybody that may be in a situation just like that to not be afraid to pull that one out of your sleeve. It may keep you safe as well. This was a long time ago, so the timeline might be a little bit off, and some details are a bit fuzzy, but I've written it out exactly as I recall it. In the early 2000s, my family was living in Europe, and in December of 2001, we were coming back home to Latin America for a Christmas vacation. My brother and I, both in high school at the time, and my dad were flying together from Paris to Miami. My dad was seated in business class, while my brother and I were in coach, sitting in the middle 2 seats of a middle row. The flight was pretty normal at first, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. About 4 or 5 hours into the flight, I was reading a book, almost dozing off, when I heard a woman start to repeat the word "no" over and over. At first, it was real quiet, almost inaudible, but it quickly got very loud and urgent. Before I realized what was happening, she was screaming, "No, no, no," at the top of her lungs. I looked up and saw a flight attendant a few rows ahead of me, hunched over someone sitting on the window seat. My first thought was that a passenger was having a heart attack or some catastrophic health event, but her yelling was so unsettling that this couldn't be it. There was a strangely long delay in people's reactions. Nobody did anything. I completely panicked and froze in my seat. My brother, on the other hand, jumped out of his seat, jumped over the person sitting on the aisle seat to his right, and ran up to see what was going on. He was up there in a matter of seconds, and as he approached, suddenly everyone around us stood to see what was going on and or try to help. She kept screaming, and now she was struggling with this passenger. He was really tall, so tall that his whole head was visible over the back of the seat, and he had long, curly black hair. My brother came back to our row and said, "Something's wrong," before going back up to get a closer look. Passengers close to her began struggling with the guy as well. A bunch of people jumped on him and started pulling at him, and someone in the row behind him even pulled his hair back so hard that his face jerked towards the top of the plane. He let out a really loud moan, scream of pain, and then there was chaos. The aisles were so crowded that nobody could move. I saw a fire extinguisher being passed hand to hand from the back of the plane. I immediately thought there was a fire and that we were all going to die. It was an incredibly hopeless sensation to know that there was nowhere to run and no way to escape the situation unfolding in front of you. They passed the extinguisher up to a male flight attendant near the guy, and the flight attendant hit him with the butt of the extinguisher really hard in the face. They started asking for belts, headphones, straps, anything they could use to restrain this man. My brother took off his belt and gave it to the group. They wrapped everything they could around that passenger's arms, shoulders, and torso, securing him to the seat. I saw the male flight attendant who had hit him with the extinguisher carry a pair of large black tennis shoes to the back of the plane, which at the time seemed kind of strange, but I didn't think much of it. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board to sedate the guy. People kept asking if there was a flight marshal on board as well, but nobody came forward. I can't remember exactly how or when things calmed down, but eventually everyone was told to return to their seats. A small group of the people that helped to restrain the guy were asked to keep guard on a rotation. There were always at least a few people sitting behind him or next to him, keeping an eye on him. I think there was even someone behind him holding a fistful of his hair for the rest of the flight. The pilot announced over the PA that there had been a security breach. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was vague. And ultimately that we were being diverted to Logan Airport in Boston. He said they didn't know if the person was working alone, so get to know your neighbor. We were in the middle of the Atlantic, with maybe 4 more hours to go before we could land. Things were a bit ominous and tense, but for the most part, everyone tried to maintain a friendly disposition and stay in a good mood. Nobody knew what had actually just happened. We weren't allowed to get up from our seats, and if you had to use the bathroom, you needed to call a flight attendant to escort you to the lavatory, where you weren't allowed to lock the door. I remember a grumpy old Frenchman, a few rows from us, got really annoyed after a while and kept getting up without permission just to annoy the flight attendants. They weren't happy. After a while, they put on the movie Legally Blonde to distract passengers. My brother and I went up to business class to talk to my dad. Apparently they didn't hear the extent of the chaos back in coach, and they were all going about business as usual. A few hours later, as we approached the U.S., we saw fighter jets outside of the windows on both sides of the plane. The pilot announced that they were there to escort us to Boston. A few little kids got really excited watching the jets. I later learned that these are the last resort security measures to prevent hijacked planes from repeating 9/11 style attacks. They were supposed to shoot us down in case of a major threat. We landed and were told to stay seated. A SWAT team came on board carrying assault rifles and tons of body armor. They cut off all the guy's restraints and took him off the plane. I saw everything in detail, since we were seated only a few rows behind him. We were parked in the middle of the tarmac for a long time before we were allowed to disembark. I remember seeing pieces of my brother's belt on the guy's seat as we left, and thought about taking one as a souvenir, but then I thought better of it. We were taken to a baggage claim area in Boston Logan Airport that was surrounded by a large metal fence to keep us all in one place. We were there for what felt like 3 or 4 hours, just waiting anxiously, and nobody would explain a thing to us. Passengers were getting really agitated, shaking the metal fences, and yelling at airport personnel that this was inhumane treatment. There was no food, nowhere to sit, and children were crying all over. Dozens of people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousel. They finally ordered a bunch of pizzas and led us into a waiting area with actual chairs, where each passenger was interrogated by the FBI. They were astonishingly unfriendly. I guess they were trying to discern if the guy had any partners on board. They then shuttled us to our baggage, where security officers thoroughly hand-searched every single passenger's shoes, suitcases, and carry-on bags, while patting everyone down as well. We were finally allowed to make a phone call, and we called my mom. The rest of the family was completely hysterical. They had been watching the news all day and knew that a member of an Islamic extremist terrorist group had tried to blow up our flight with a bomb that he had smuggled on board in his shoe. We had absolutely no idea what had really happened up until this moment, as we were kept completely in the dark. It was a very strange sensation. Up until this point, my dad, brother, and I had actually remained pretty relaxed considering the circumstances, and were more annoyed about the inconvenient changes to our travel itinerary than the crazy experience on the plane. We had no idea how bad the security breach really was, and how close we came to being killed. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were put on another flight home. My brother made the mistake of giving a few interviews to CNN and other networks while we were in Boston, so when we landed in our small country, he was immediately swarmed by the press and gave a bunch of interviews despite being exhausted. I was happy to finally sit and relax with my family after the longest and most stressful trip of my life. We later learned that the bomber, Richard Reed, had actually tried to board the same flight on the previous day. He was detained and questioned by French security because of multiple red flags. He had no luggage and had purchased a one-way ticket with cash, and this caused him to miss his flight. They put him on the next day's flight and put him up in a hotel kind of far from the airport, since everything nearby was booked. The following day, it rained, and on the walk from the hotel to the airport, his shoes got wet. This very well might have been the reason that he had trouble lighting the wick in his shoe. His plan was to light it mid-flight. He waited until the passenger next to him went to the bathroom, and then he attempted to light his shoe with matches. The female flight attendant that first engaged him had smelled the matches and was walking up and down the aisle to look for the passenger who, she had assumed, was trying to smoke a cigarette. She saw him with his shoe in his lap and immediately tried to take it from him. They struggled, and he bit her hand. Reed is now serving 3 life terms in prison for his attempt. A few things that I'm incredibly grateful for from that flight: the quick and decisive actions of those attendants and the passengers aboard, as well as the inclement weather of France, knowing now that that's probably what saved us all from a fiery death above the ocean. I'll start by saying that I have a terrible biological father. He has been a shady person all of my life and constantly caused me lots of grief. This is just one of those examples. When I was 4, my parents split up. My mother and I moved states, and they agreed that I would visit my dad over school holidays for a week. This particular time, I had been with him for a few days when I was playing with my cousin at a nearby park. A car pulled up, and I recognized the man as one of my dad's friends. He called me over, and without thinking, I ran over to him and left my cousin at the park. He asked me if I could show him where my dad lived, and I agreed and got in the car. I gave directions and didn't notice at all that he wasn't following them correctly. Looking back, I didn't really know the way anyhow. After way too long, I did realize that we were getting closer to the city, which is far from my dad's house. We pulled up at a house that I didn't recognize, and the man told me to wait in the car. I did. I didn't feel scared at all for some reason at this point. He eventually took me inside, and I definitely started to feel unsafe then. I remember 2 girls passed out in the main room, and a much older man was feeling them up everywhere. I made eye contact with this man, and he made me feel sick to my stomach. I had definitely figured out that this was a bad situation at this juncture. A lady took me into a bedroom and brought me a sandwich. The bread was stale, and I wasn't hungry, but I ate it anyway because I felt bad for her, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what I was thinking about then. The lady told me a lot of things that I didn't understand, but when she left, I remember thinking my dad was coming to pick me up soon. I fell asleep waiting for him. I wet the bed that night, and no one came to see me until the next day, as I cried very loudly and banged on the door. The lady came back and yelled at me for stinking up her bedroom, and I asked about my dad. She said he was coming tonight after he finished work. She didn't offer me a shower or a bath, so I sat in my soiled pants all day. After that, everything turned into a blur, really. My dad didn't come that night, and I was terrified. In my head, I felt like I was there for months. I thought I was missing school, and that everyone had forgotten about me. In reality, I was there for 5 days. They let me take 1 shower. I don't remember eating much, except for boring sandwiches, and I had chips and gravy once. After not being able to get a hold of me or my dad for so long, In addition to me missing my pre-booked flight home, my mom drove across country to come and get me. She knew that something wasn't right, and she didn't ignore her gut feeling when it was time to come find me. Thank God she did. She found my dad at his girlfriend's house, methed out completely, hiding out. Turns out he owed a lot of drug money to the people who had taken me. They had told him that they had me, but he couldn't afford it or didn't want me back. Whatever it was, he didn't bother to try to get me back at all. My amazing mom paid his debt for him after borrowing from a lot of people, and then she came back to get me. I remember someone came into the room and told me my mom was here. When I walked out of that terrible room, I could smell her. It was the best feeling to feel safe again. She took me home, and I didn't see my dad again for a long, long time. She never called the police. My parents' relationship was very complicated then, and I fully understand the choices that she made. I'm definitely okay now. I've spoken about this in therapy, and I've come to terms with most of the things that I went through as a child, but still a f***ed up situation for a 4-year-old girl to have to be in. When I was 20 years old, so about 6 years ago, I worked as a pizza delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift got fired due to a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an asshole, and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, that I'd be fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made it into our delivery radius. I punch it in on my GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. But the house that I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30. Still no answer. I'm standing there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down, but thankfully a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s, pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money, I hand him the pizza, and as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the evening. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as the last time and ring the doorbell. He answered the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him that I was tired and couldn't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asked me what my name is. Being kind of tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was about 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway staring at me until he finally went back inside once I got my car started. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers. They agree that it was pretty creepy, except for my boss who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. Like I said, asshole. A week later, as I'm working the night shift again, we get an order from the same guy, and this is when finally hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m., and keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in the house was on. I get out of my car, and I walk to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time he was wearing a suit, and I jumped back. He laughs and said, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window and figured I'd just open the door now so that you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house. So is he sitting in the dark this whole time? And if so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asked me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the f***? I once again tell him that I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side, and then he grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially bricks at this point, and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him, "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He stares at me with the most sinister look I've seen on someone's face and says, "I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into the house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that to this day I'm still thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosened his grip on me. That allowed me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and tries pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and yells, "Why are you making this so f***ing difficult?" I grab a half-filled soda bottle that I had in the cup holder and throw it at him. Luckily, it hits his head and he lets me go once more. I slam the door, and all of a sudden he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot and reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood screaming, "Stop the f***ing car." I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily he falls off the hood of my car in a heap. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as I could. In my panic state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared he was following me. Eventually, I reached the red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworkers knew that something was wrong. I practically broke down in front of them, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me by beginning to apologize profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift in the first place. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as the scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed and, strangely enough, managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the very next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I receive an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later for much worse crimes targeted at women. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for having an inappropriate relationship with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted that they would find him. And indeed, they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently, he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late one night. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time. They called the police, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police give chase. He blew through a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to the blow long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything that they did, and for informing me, and then I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I only felt relief. Relief that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Relief that I would never have to encounter him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. Although this happened years ago, every so often I get the unsettling thought, wondering what just would have happened if he'd managed to pull me into that house. I shudder every time it comes to mind. Way back in 2000 or 2001, I was driving by myself from visiting my mom in Colorado back to my home state of Arizona. I was in a station wagon and had a desk that my mom had given me that was my grandfather's. I've always been scared driving at night that there's someone in my back seat that's going to get me. This might be because of too many scary movies, or because my mom's paranoia rubbed off on me. I was in the Army and drove back and forth a lot to visit her. She would get mad at me for sleeping at rest stops or gas stations and tell me that someone was going to kidnap me, or worse. But I just didn't want to be bothered with the hassle and expense of a motel most of the time. I digress. So I'm driving an empty stretch of highway late at night with no other cars around. This red truck approaches me from behind, flashing his lights and honking his horn at me. I was thinking to myself that there was something wrong with my car, or maybe there was something wrong with the desk in the hatchback, because why else would he be so insistent on trying to pull me over? So I do. I pull over. I was in my mid-20s and still a bit naive, just so you know. As I start to exit my car, he's directly behind me and still flashing his lights and honking his horn. I got about to the middle of my car as I was walking back towards his when it hits me. Why is he still honking at me when I'm out of my car? That's odd. Then he starts to get out of his truck, and that's when I knew something just wasn't right. I jumped back in my car and sped off. The next exit was about 45 miles away, and he followed me the entire time. I take the first exit and go to a crowded grocery store with a laundromat next to it. There was an ambulance parked at the laundromat with its lights flashing, so I parked right next to it. I figured that if there was an ambulance, then eventually a police officer would come. The man stayed in his truck in the grocery store parking lot, watching me the entire time. I was terrified. I didn't want to get out of my car, and felt like an idiot if I would have had to tell someone what happened. I waited about an hour, and he finally left. After he left, I waited a little longer before continuing my drive back to Arizona. I was paranoid and watchful for any red trucks the entire time. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I'm watching Unsolved Mysteries or some similar type of crime show with my husband at the time, and what story pops up? One about a man on that exact stretch of highway with a red truck that used those exact tactics to get a few women to pull over before murdering them. While they never caught this man and were only able to profile him based on the story of one survivor, I know in my heart of hearts that that's who I encountered that night, and I'm thankful every day that my fate did not match that of those poor, unlucky women. I suppose the lesson to be learned here is, if you're ever driving down a lonely, dark highway, be very selective who you pull over for.